Part 2. Everybody is stupid except for me. This video is a part 2 to a retrospective series on The Simpsons. Part 1 should be viewable in a card at the top of the screen now, as well as being linked in the description itself. I don't intend for this video series to ever require watching the previous entries in order to be comprehensible, but I do build upon some themes picked up in previous sections, and assume at least some familiarity with the source material as a whole. All of this to say that watching part 1 of this series is expected, but not required. Like the rest of the series, this retrospective will be split into individual episode reviews, which themselves are split into 3 sections: Recap, Review, and Wrap-Up. Recap is a general summary of the episode. Review contains my thoughts on that episode in particular. Wrap-Up is for miscellaneous ideas that don't fit into any other place. And as usual, a disclaimer. Due to its long-running status and the changing landscape of culture over the several decades that the show has been running for, The Simpsons deals with a variety of issues, including substance abuse, suicide, sexual assault, talking dogs, and various flavors of bigotry. While I make strong attempts in this script to sanitize my language for an easier viewing experience, neither I nor the show stray away from discussion on these topics, and as such, listener discretion is advised. Now let's get right into this thing, shall we? Season 4. Season 3 can be considered an experimental season of television in the sense that many of the plots and locations grew more bizarre than before. The Simpsons had established itself as a show that wasn't afraid to hold a mirror to the world, not by reflecting the mundanity of everyday experiences, but the absurdity. As the show has established itself as a staple of television for its frank look at the modern Western family, all that was required of the showrunners to continue in this direction was that they maintain a strong connection to the more character-driven plots. And then, they'd be in the clear to get away with practically anything, so long as they remembered those roots. Set pieces got grander, and the familiar became less so. Instead of characters going camping and winding up on a disastrous vacation, they make the news for overthrowing the comically brutal conditions of a summer camp before declaring tribal law. But it's never such an absurd thing that the audience views it as having gone too far, or stretching the limits of believability. As long as Homer acts like Homer, he can be anywhere and do anything without acting out of character. He's become a vessel for absurdity rather than its conduit, being swept along with whatever the universe throws at it without directly starting off that plot, because anything that happens can easily be waved off as societal. Season 4 is also when the first hints of a Simpsons movie began to circulate in rumor. There was a proposal to capitalize on the show's massive success by spreading to different mediums. The Simpsons had already obtained arcade machines, merchandising deals, and a myriad crossovers, so it seemed like the next logical step was to put America's family on the big screen. But this was perhaps a half-implemented idea, proposed too late, as the only real suggestions we have so far as to what the movie might be is that the episode Kamp Krusty was proposed as a potential script, implying that that episode was already written, and the movie idea was more of a floater than a genuine pitch. Kamp Krusty. It's the last day of school. Bart and Lisa were both promised that they'd be allowed to attend Kamp Krusty over the summer if they received at least a C average. While Lisa is able to pass with relative ease, Bart does not make it. Although Homer admits that he doesn't really want the boy hanging around the house for 6 weeks anyway, so he allows them both to go regardless. But as it turns out, Kamp Krusty has the same seal of quality as the rest of the Krusty label, barely functional, if not outright hostile to its user base. But their letters home are assumed to be creative embellishments on Lisa's part by Marge and Homer, who have found themselves in the best condition of their lives without the kids to run them ragged. The children are terrorized by the camp counselors for the duration, with Bart only holding on to sanity with his misguided belief that Krusty will eventually show up to make everything better. But when the head counselor tries to pass Barney off as the TV show clown, Bart snaps and leads the kids in an active rebellion against the camp. The chaos draws the attention of the media, and the report both causes Homer's health to return to how it was before, while also making Krusty himself show up to right the wrong, by taking the children to Tijuana. Season 4 starts out with very little fanfare, heading directly into the next set of episodes proper, as though there were never a break to begin with. although this is likely more due to the fact that this episode is really a Season 3 episode, being the last one produced, although the second to last aired, before Gracie Films would move its domestic animation from Klasky Skupo to Film Roman. Not that this distinction matters much anyway. The plot stretches rather thin in the middle, largely being put on the sidelines in order to have a few rapid gags about the poor condition of the camp, no different than many other Simpsons episodes have done before, and will continue to do later. Perhaps this is also telling of the fact that this episode was ultimately dropped of a potential outline for the plot of the Simpsons movie. The reason for this was the fact that the showrunners were struggling to stretch the plot out to 90 minutes. Not a surprise, as Simpsons plots tend to only take up half their usual 22, with the rest being comedic padding. This is the formula that's given the TV family its iconic status, and a stretch to 90 minutes would have had to be something more thoroughly planned to properly fit the silver screen. A streetcar named Marge. Marge auditions for a position in a play, a musical rendition of A Streetcar Named Desire. Homer is unreceptive to her dream, and she ultimately doesn't get the part of Blanche Dubois that she tried out for. That is, until the play's director overhears her dejectedly talking to Homer on the phone and realizes the potential. Though this is something that isn't completely evident at first, as Marge has spent so much time living and putting up with a Stanley that she's merely collapsed under the weight of expectation. But when Homer annoys her during a rehearsal, Marge discovers a new hidden talent as a method actor and is able to put on a riveting performance. One that causes Homer to nearly grow introspective as to his role within his wife's life. In the end, his feelings on the play end up serving as a stand-in for an apology for his personality, and the two repair the strain on their relationship. Meanwhile, Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, where she plans and executes a daring heist to retrieve her pacifier. This episode, when contrasted with the previous, shows two different sides of The Simpsons in terms of how stories tend to develop. Kamp Krusty was an unrealistic twist on a realistic setup. The kids go to a summer camp, mundane, and wind up taking over and creating a tribal government, insane. In Streetcar, Marge auditions for a play, and the play winds up going off without much of a hitch. Characters behave as real people would, and the plot never takes a turn for the unpredictable. As a result, Streetcar winds up being a much more character-driven episode, whereas Kamp Krusty is an episode more about the town of Springfield instead. Or maybe that's backwards. Perhaps the reason that this episode was played much more straight is because it was character-driven from the outset. And so this is how The Simpsons is able to stay as fresh as it does, by seamlessly alternating between rambunctious craziness, cultural satire, and more heartfelt character plots while keeping the audience on its toes enough that you never know precisely what you'll get. Plots never grow tiring, and interest remains high moving forward. The subplot involving Maggie, though, is something that is utterly classic Simpsons. Her quote, "sniper baby" personality is a wordless homage to The Great Escape, watches like something out of the first season's most iconic set pieces. And it's interesting to see how the show can stay so close to its roots while also continuing to stay relevant. Homer the Heretic. On a particularly miserable day, Homer decides that he would rather stay home than go to church. His family leaves him and has an awful time as the doors freeze shut in the heaterless room. But Homer enjoys his lazy Sunday and proclaims that he's not going to church the following Sunday either. Various religious leaders, as well as his family from Springfield, try to recruit him/convince him to return, but Homer refuses all of them. But that Sunday, a cigar catches fire in his house, and the home is quickly engulfed in flames, trapping Homer inside. It's up to everybody who wasn't at church that Sunday to save him, and upon their success he realizes that, despite ignoring them, the faithful community still acted to save his body, even if they couldn't save his soul. In the end, Homer decides to go back to church, becoming just as active a Christian as he was before. In spite of the general skepticism that the Simpsons writers tend to have for organized religion, the show itself rarely portrays faith as an inherently negative thing. Flanders is a better person than Homer, and this is largely viewed as both a cause and effect of his faith. Church is mentioned by Marge as something she has an obligation to her family to send them to. And in the end, it's every other religious community acting together that resolves the danger in this episode, a showing of community unity. The way this episode is structured gives an opportunity for the writers to make jokes about other religions in a way that makes sense around the context rather than being a random jab at a potentially sensitive topic. This, combined with the fact that Homer is being used as a mouthpiece for these observations while serving as the bad guy in the plot, means that they receive the license to say whatever they want, but not too much scrutiny levied at them for being crude or insensitive, as they can abandon responsibility due to Homer's behavior not being condoned by the narrative. It's this sort of structure that requires the, quote, jerk-ass Homer personality to shine through in various episodes moving forward, as it allows the writers to give the audience a more candid look at negative social perceptions of their subject of satirization, through the lens of an archetypical, ugly American. Lisa the Beauty Queen. After receiving an unflattering caricature drawing of herself, Lisa begins to feel self-conscious about her looks. So Homer enters her in the Little Miss Springfield pageant, with the hopes of making her feel better about herself. Although Lisa doesn't appreciate being entered against her will, the family comes together to boost her confidence and chances of winning, ultimately granting her runner-up. But when the real Little Miss Springfield is incapacitated, Lisa takes over her duties, which include location opening and being the newest corporate shill for Laramie Cigarettes' push to indoctrinate the young smokers. She appreciates her new position for a while, but soon the guilt of getting kids addicted to nicotine weighs on her, and she rejects the position, calling out corruption and injustice anytime she gets an audience. This draws the ire of Springfield's elite, who discover that Homer filled out her application wrong, and they oust her from the position. But rather than being upset, Lisa is instead glad she was able to make a small difference, and of course, get that self-esteem boost that she needed all along. Lisa has often served as a creator's soapbox, existing to point out the injustices in the world and put a more defined defamation against anything that the showrunners don't want to risk leaving up to interpretation. But far from purely existing as a conduit for this sort of moralizing, Lisa is, at the end of it all, a little girl. She still has the same worries and anxieties you would expect of someone her age to have, and this episode best shows off the dichotomy between these two parts of her psyche. Lisa is absolutely the kind of character to denounce the high societal expectations placed on young girls, but that doesn't mean that she's immune to the pressures purely because she's aware of them. Through this episode, Lisa undergoes an arc of feeling depressed about her anxiety and slowly overcoming the obstacle, not due to the proof that she's able to win a beauty pageant, but from the fact that her family was able to rally around her entrance. Her worries about her physical appearance are all but gone by the time the pageant comes around. So it was never a question of objective beauty standards, but the confidence of the people you care about vouching for your better qualities. And it's these qualities Lisa then defaults to after she does, in the end, obtain the position of Little Miss Springfield. Treehouse of Horror III. The Simpson family are hosting a Halloween party, but due to Homer eating the entertainment for the night, they decide to go around telling ghost stories instead. The first is Lisa's Clown Without Pity. Homer forgets to buy Bart a birthday present, and so, in his rush, he winds up entering a store of cursed objects and purchasing a talking Krusty doll. Bart loves the gift, but the gift doesn't love Homer, and repeatedly says it's going to kill him. Despite his efforts to warn his family or dispose of the doll, it winds up attacking him, and so Marge has to call a support line who simply turns the doll from evil to good. The next story is Grandpa Simpson's King Homer, a retelling of the 1933 King Kong with that classic Simpsons parody style. But instead of King Homer climbing a building with his captive Marge, he simply collapses from exhaustion one story in, ultimately marrying her instead of continuing to eat people. Finally, Bart tells his story, Dial Z for Zombies. After being made to read a book for a report in class, Bart comes across an occult title in the library's occult section. He decides to show off his new book by resurrecting Lisa's pet Snowball the First, but he accidentally uses the wrong spell and resurrects all the dead in Springfield instead. The family fights for their survival before ultimately deciding that they have to make their way back to the library to learn to undo the spell. They make it, with Homer shooting a few townsfolk along the way, and everything is put back to the way it was, with the Simpson family glad they didn't become mindless zombies as they stare wide-eyed at the television. Itchy and Scratchy, the movie. Homer and Marge attend parent-teacher night, where Homer is praised for his handling of Lisa's education, while Marge gets the short end of the stick and is told about Bart's repeated behavioral issues. At the advice of Miss Krabappel, the parents decide that they need to be more strong-willed when punishing Bart, sticking to it instead of caving after he pretends to have learned his lesson. They fail for a while, but when Maggie steals the family car due to Bart neglecting to watch her, Homer decides to ban Bart from seeing the cultural event of the generation, the Itchy and Scratchy movie. Bart is convinced his parents will cave like they always do, but as the time goes on, and everybody else can't stop talking about how great it was, he slowly realizes that Homer and Marge really mean it this time. The episode ends with a cut to the future, with Bart as a Supreme Court justice walking alongside an elderly Homer, who finally decides that the boys learned its lesson, and the two watch the rerun of the movie together. Bartmania swept through the nation during the airing of the last few seasons, and this season was hardly different. The Simpsons were still a cultural icon, and school teachers were just as annoyed as every boy under 13 wouldn't stop saying, "Don't have a cow, man." But far from kneeling to the complaints of those who had to put up with it the most, the Simpsons writing staff responded in an unsurprising way. If your kid is annoying, it's hardly their fault. Bart's behavior here isn't blamed on television or society. It's Marge and Homer never sticking to proper discipline. And so if you have the time to write to the network complaining about the subject matter on display, you also have the time to change the channel when your kids are watching. Bart's future has always been something ambiguous, as he's meant to represent American children in general, specifically how Gen X would grow and develop. At the time, it was easy to look at society through a glass-half-empty perspective and assume that the future was doomed. But The Simpsons manages to take a more nuanced view than a simple good-bad decision. Because while Bart is shown to be a slacker with very little positive future, Homer was never shown to be especially promising either, and things have turned out alright for him. Not good, not bad, but alright. Marge gets a job. When the Simpson household sinks due to a foundation issue, Marge has to get a job to continue to support the family so they can pay to have it fixed. She winds up working at the nuclear power plant, and is quickly noticed by Mr. Burns. Burns tries to seduce her, listening to her suggestions and kidnapping Tom Jones to perform for her. But when he finds out that she's married, the love turns to hatred and he fires her. The Simpsons try to sue, but the plant's lawyers are too threatening for any attorney to bother, and Marge prepares to slink away dejected. But Homer refuses to leave without an apology, and Mr. Burns realizes that he loves her too. So he decides not to fire Homer as well, letting him keep the job for Marge's sake. In the B-plot, Bart fakes getting sick to get out of a test, but after a few bouts of lying, eventually winds up getting attacked by a loose wolf while retaking it. But Mrs. Krabappel doesn't believe his cries for help, which last until Willie wrestles the animal into submission. Following up on a theme from last episode, this season is, in general, much less willing to let Bart off the hook for any of his misbehavior. Earlier seasons have taken a similar approach to plots of realistic consequences for his actions, but they've always hidden behind a veneer of schmaltz. If Bart faces consequences, we see him learn from them and eventually come out with a happy ending due to the lesson learned. Now, the happy ending is much less of a guarantee. While he might become a Supreme Court justice for internalizing the lessons on his own, not doing so will cause that lesson to be taught in a much more extreme manner. But as for characters not learning lessons, Mr. Burns' unrequited crush and ensuing harassment of Marge is something that, while portrayed as the wrong thing to do, is still not something he faces many consequences for. His high-priced lawyers can prevent a lawsuit, and the worst thing that happens is a stern talking to from Homer that results in him giving Marge a holiday anyway. He even gets away with kidnapping and threatening Tom Jones, with it all played off as a joke, much in the same way that his other actions are viewed as non-threatening purely because he has too much money to come across as wanting for anything. New kid on the block. The Winfields, next-door neighbors to the Simpsons, move out of the neighborhood, leaving the house next door vacant. As Homer steals their expired medications, Bart and Lisa use the opportunity to mess around in the basement, where they meet their new neighbors, the Powers family, specifically Laura Powers, a teenage girl who Bart quickly falls for. She and him share much of the same crude humor as one another, her regular babysitting of the kids causing him to become more and more infatuated. But when Laura announces that she's dating Jimbo, one of the school bullies, Bart is heartbroken, which inspires him to use his prank phone call habit to lure a knife-wielding Moe to show off that Jimbo isn't so tough after all. This occurs as Homer sues a seafood restaurant for claiming to serve all-you-can-eat, despite Homer being kicked out for his appetite. They sue, which causes the restaurant owner, Captain McAllister, to agree to a deal where Homer is reimbursed with food so long as he serves as an attraction for the restaurant. The Simpsons make for bad neighbors. This is the reason the Winfields move out, and the reason nobody wants to move in except for the Powers family, who don't appear to have the luxury of being choosy. But this ends up being a boon to Bart, as the only type of person who could tolerate being near his family is the type of person who would raise a child with similar interests. And yet it's also this similar rebelliousness streak that causes Laura to fall for Jimbo, who really is just an older, slightly more rebellious Bart. But in his role as such, Jimbo would have the same insecurities as Bart. While claiming to be a rebel, both have the softer side to them that they attempt to cover up with their antics. Something that makes confessing to Laura difficult, and something that causes him to miss out on his chance with her. So calling a knife-wielding maniac to humble their competition is something that Bart knows to do as a result of accepting his own flaws, even if the narrative never makes him answer for them. The rest of this episode is more standard Simpsons fare. Homer makes a lawsuit that would be frivolous to the average American, but it's still the type of thing that could be true, to the point that you might believe it if it were a newspaper headline with no attached article. Mr. Plow. Homer wrecks both family cars in a heavy snowstorm, which causes the Simpson family to go shopping for a new one. Homer impulse purchases a snowplow, using it to plow driveways as the titular Mr. Plow, and receiving the love and attention of the snowed-in town of Springfield. But when Barney is inspired by Homer's newfound success to start his own snowplow business as the Plow King, stealing all of Homer's customer base and leaving the two former friends in a feud. When their competition turns less friendly, Homer decides to call in a fake job to Barney's business, leading him up to the top of Springfield's most precarious mountain. But when this winds up trapping the guy beneath the blizzard, Homer regrets his actions and rushes to save his friend. In the end, the two are reunited and they resolve to run their business together instead of being at one another's throats, just in time for an unseasonal heat wave to melt all the snow and leave the two without their jobs. There seems to be a direct relationship between the heartfelt of the episodes of The Simpsons and the sillier ones. Perhaps the antics being larger than life can detract and distract from the relatability that makes the heartwarming scenes of togetherness work so well. Or maybe it's a result of the different approaches when outlining episodes. Again, The Simpsons is written by a room of writers rather than individual credits. Those only exist for whoever penned the initial outline. Either way, you can usually tell what they're going for by gauging the number of and proliferation of celebrity guest stars. The moment Adam West showed up playing himself, you should be able to tell that this episode isn't meant to take itself completely seriously. That Homer's business can be intruded on by Barney of all people is perhaps a sign that it was doomed to fail from the start. If a drunkard like him can take over the area with a monopoly, then perhaps there was a reason that the town of Springfield was underserved in the first place, that the two idiots can make it big and then fail immediately afterwards. Lisa's first word. While trying to get Maggie to say her first word, the Simpson family becomes curious as to the first word of Lisa, and so Marge regales them the tale. The Simpson family was living in a small apartment together when their second pregnancy was discovered, so they moved to a bigger house that would fit all four of them, though this annoys Bart, who preferred their old home. What also annoys him is the fact that his old life as the baby gets taken from him as his old crib is reused for Lisa, and he starts to be viewed as less important than his new sibling. After several attempts to get rid of his sister, he finally decides to run away from the lack of attention, only for Lisa to, at the last second, call out to him, her first word being Bart. Meanwhile, Krusty runs a promotional campaign for free burgers, financially ruined by the Soviet boycott of the Olympic Games. Another flashback episode, this one is also written by Jeff Martin as he had done I Married Marge in the past. Flashback episodes have always been a means of taking a particular year and poking fun at major news stories that occurred then, such as the subplot involving the Olympics and lines like Lisa's college fund being saved in Lincoln Savings and Loan. Despite these gags, the episode ran short, requiring inclusions such as the Itchy and Scratchy segment as well as the extended opening sequence. The pacing ultimately works itself out to the point that the whole episode builds up to a single moment that occurs at the very end. But that's fine because this episode is only one of the heartwarming character pieces on the surface level. It's meant to be an episode about Bart and Lisa's relationship, but as the latter is an infant child, we instead get a series of set pieces involving Bart's slow annoyance with his new life that has little to do with the character whose name is in the episode's title. At the end, we hear that Lisa's first word was Bart due to the girl's love for her older brother, and yet that love is never really something shown to the audience. We get several scenes of Bart slowly being driven mad by his sister and conspiring to get her out of the picture, but we don't get a lot from Lisa's perspective, something that could have not only padded the episode to a usual runtime, but also made the ending that much more satisfying in its payoff. Homer's Triple Bypass. Homer's bad eating habits catch up to him and he starts to suffer increasingly frequent heart murmurs, which culminates in a full-on heart attack when he gets verbally assaulted by Mr. Burns, winding him up in the hospital. Dr. Hibbert warns him that he may not survive the next incident and advises a bypass surgery, but the Simpson family cannot afford it at its high price point, and they're forced to make do with hoping for the best. That is, until they learn of the services of Dr. Nick Riviera, a local quack who will do any surgery for cheap. His inexperience makes the success of the surgery an unsure thing, and as the days go on, the family becomes more and more nervous about his chances. But Lisa takes to researching the latest medical breakthroughs in order to assuage her fears of whether the surgery is survivable, and this ends up paying off as she is able to guide Dr. Nick through the procedure. Homer survives and the family gets a happy ending. This episode makes a spiritual homage to the Season 2 episode One Fish, Two Fish, Blowfish, Bluefish, where Homer likewise tries to make peace with his impending death. In both plots, he makes an attempt to settle affairs while likewise leaving his children out of it for as long as possible, hoping their last memories of him can be positive instead of full of dread. It's fitting for his character that when things are pushed to an extreme point, his last few moments are spent trying to get a life insurance policy for the family and making sure they don't wind up bankrupted by medical debt. This episode is starkly American to a depressing degree. Homer is given a heart attack through stress and diet, a combination of fatty foods, traffic congestion, and a tyrant for a boss, all made worse by the US healthcare system. As he is a stand-in for the average American citizen, it's expected that his downfall would be a conglomeration of the worst parts of our lives. And yet, in the same way that his personality winds up hospitalizing him, his closeness to his family is what saves the day, as Lisa is able to use her curiosity to guide the surgery to success. If the things that he does wrong are what hurt him, then it's the things that he does right that save him. Marge versus the Monorail. When Mr. Burns is fined for illegally dumping nuclear waste, the town of Springfield has to come together to decide what to spend the money on. They plan on repairing Main Street until Lyle Landley, a conman, convinces the town to build a large monorail with the money. But Marge has concerns with the construction, especially when Homer is declared to be the monorail's conductor despite his lack of formal training. When she snoops a bit, she discovers that Lyle is planning on cutting as many corners as possible and running off with the money. So she heads to one of the other towns he's constructed a monorail in to find someone more familiar with the issues, who can help to prevent disaster. But the efforts are too late, as the monorail has already taken off and is running rampant through its tracks, with no functioning brakes. But some quick thinking by Homer is able to anchor the speeding car to a giant donut, and the day is saved, with Springfield never committing another folly again, mostly. Structurally, this episode is divided into two parts, one following Marge's attempts to learn more about and disarm the monorail, and the other to tell a series of gags related to Springfield's incompetence at handling the new construction. There's very little plot progression in the latter part, and most of the synopsis I gave was related to a section of the episode that got disproportionately little screen time. But this is typical of The Simpsons' silly episode formula, and this is probably one of the least serious episodes that the show has, as well as one of the most highly rated. Marge vs. the Monorail best represents the Conan O'Brien era of The Simpsons, as it is defined by its absurd non-sequitur humor, blasé references to pop culture, and the in-your-face exaggerations of society that make characters appear like the larger-than-life stereotypes that come out of retelling family stories time and time again. The town of Springfield falls for a scam, but their general incompetence when it comes to everything prevents them from realizing that corners are being cut, and the result essentially writes itself. Selma's Choice. The Bouviers attend the funeral of great-aunt Gladys, who, among other things, leaves the advice to Patty and Selma not to die alone and marry before it's too late. This causes Selma to grow worried that she's running out of time, and so she turns to video dating and later artificial insemination to finally follow her dream of raising a child. But that weekend, Homer and Marge plan on taking their children to Duff Gardens as a family. But when Homer eats a moldy sandwich, he gets too sick to go with the kids, and so they decide to give Selma a chance to practice raising children by going in their stead. This results in failure, as Bart gets arrested by park security, and Lisa grows delirious from drinking ride water on a dare. In the end, Selma realizes that she's no good at taking care of human children, and decides to adopt Jub Jub, Gladys's pet iguana, instead. Patty and Selma have been shown before as the type to enjoy their leisure time more than their time spent with family. And while it isn't as though they're the type to actively resent spending time with relatives, those sort of relationships can be shown to tie them down in a way that's not considered worth it. This isn't something exclusive to the twins either. Homer and Marge get a day away from their children and very quickly reinvigorate their love life, getting along much in the same way that they did during Kamp Krusty. And so it comes down to a split decision between the desire to live freely and live for others. Is the satisfaction of raising a miniature you greater than the potentially missed satisfaction from your social life without them? In Selma's case, the answer is different than in Marge's. It isn't as though Selma actually fails to raise the children in an overwhelming way either. Bart and Lisa get into hijinks not unlike the kind of trouble they'd have found if they traveled with their parents. It's less about Selma's failure to control them, as it is her failure to control herself when they behave in a way that's more or less inevitable. Brother from the same planet. When Homer forgets to pick up Bart from a soccer practice, the boy gets tired of his father's neglect and hires a big brother from a non-profit for troubled children. Tom, Bart's new caretaker, is a much better person and companion than Homer ever was, something that Bart plays up by telling lies about how awful his father is. This makes Homer jealous as he realizes that his son no longer cares about or looks up to him, so he decides to get revenge on his son by adopting a little brother from the same charity, one Peppy. The two spoil their proxy family member out of spite before eventually the four wind up at Marine World during a sponsored event. Remembering the horrible things Bart claims Homer has done, Tom attacks the man, and he and Homer end up fighting through downtown. But Bart is impressed by his father's dirty tactics, and they bond over Homer teaching his son how to fight like a wimp. In the B-plot, Lisa gets addicted to a Corey hotline to the point of racking up an expensive phone bill, and eventually getting into trouble at school. So Marge stays up with her overnight to help her detox from the Coreys. Homer and Bart have never been especially nice to one another, but have overall maintained a functional, if not ideal, relationship over the years. It's a bit telling that in their replacements for one another, they put on fake personalities to try to maintain that one. Bart doesn't act like Bart around Tom, pretending to be a person a bit more, well, like Peppy. Likewise, Homer pretends to be the proper parental figure in Peppy's life, as if to show off to Bart that he could be a nice person if Bart were more willing to play along. But these relationships are doomed if they're based off lies of people pretending to be who they're not, certainly much more doomed than that of Peppy and Tom, as we see at the end of the episode. Tom was originally meant to be played by Tom Cruise, as the writers were told he was interested in a guest star spot, but despite filling the script with references to his movies, he turned down the role and it was taken by Phil Hartman instead. The Ren and Stimpy parody went off better though, as it was actually penned by a layout artist from the show, and so managed to keep with the original style perfectly. I Love Lisa. When Ralph doesn't get a single Valentine gift, Lisa takes pity on him and quickly drops a card off on his desk. This causes him to become infatuated with her to the point that he follows her around, being persistent in showing off his affection. But Lisa doesn't reciprocate these feelings and wants to let him down easily, complicated when the Krusty 29th anniversary show occurs and he offers her tickets to witness it live. While there, he continues to embarrass her through association, and she snaps, telling him off in front of the entire audience. Ralph feels humiliated by this, but instead of sulking, he puts his angst into his performance as George Washington in the school's President's Day play, impressing the audience and eventually inspiring Lisa to put their relationship into healthier territory. Ralph Wiggum was revealed to be the son of Clancy Wiggum in this episode, which also marked his beginning as somewhat of a breakout character among the cast of Springfield Elementary. He's been in the background once or twice before, but has never really had a settled-upon characterization until this point, with a few early scenes showing him eating crayons or gluing his head to his shoulder to establish what his permanent personality would be moving forward. As the show moved on for more tightly written plots and into looser territory, with extra space for gags and cutaways, characters like Ralph developed as a means of filling in some of these promised blank spaces in later scripts, his dim wit becoming just as iconic as the general character of the town of Springfield that it represents. Despite the divergence from many contemporary sitcoms, The Simpsons has always taken a very similar approach to the happily ever afters of many other romance plots, where people find true love in the end of the episode by sticking to it and following other platitudes, similar to what we hear from Chief Wiggum. But this episode doesn't have that sort of idealistic optimism, yet it still maintains a similar level of satisfaction to the finale. Ralph doesn't end up with Lisa, and Lisa doesn't completely cut Ralph off as a social connection, but the spirit of compromise manages to get a good, though not perfect, conclusion. Duffless. When Homer gets pulled over for a DUI and loses his license, Marge challenges him to quit drinking beer for a month. He agrees, but is constantly tempted by the alcohol-centric world around him. As time goes on, however, Homer begins to lose weight, have more energy, and overall he's enjoying a quality of life he didn't have before. Although when he succeeds at making it through the month, he still wants to go back to his old life. And yet seeing all the barflies convinces him that maybe it's for the best if he doesn't relapse immediately, and he goes for a bike ride with Marge instead. In the B-plot, Lisa genetically modifies a giant tomato for her science fair project, which Bart throws at Principal Skinner. So to get back at her brother, she decides to compare his intelligence to that of a hamster for her project instead. When he learns of Lisa's plan to humiliate him, he decides to apply himself at the science fair in a people-pleasing way and creates an exhibit that steals the attention away from Lisa's project. As willing as this season is to put comedic exaggerations to Homer's antics, such as getting kicked out of the Flying Dutchman, it's equally willing to show the more realistic side to his lifestyle, such as in Homer's triple bypass. This episode is when Homer's alcoholism begins to have a more detrimental effect on his health, as well as his relationships. Marge is shown to be visibly upset by his continued drinking, and yet it's a recognition of this discomfort that encourages him to, in the end, decide not to go back to the way things were. The Simpsons is willing now to take a look not just into American society, but American people as well. We're a nation obsessed with drinking, so what does that mean for our health? The B-plot of this episode deals with revenge. Lisa wants vengeance against Bart for destroying her science fair project, so she plans on embarrassing him in front of the school. But when Bart learns of the plot, he changes the script on her by drawing attention away from the exhibit in the first place. This plays out as though it's going to be a moral lesson on why revenge is bad, as it appears like Bart's plan to get revenge for Lisa's revenge will set off a vicious cycle. But instead we get a situation where the whole conflict is avoided. Lisa doesn't drag Bart's name through the mud, as nobody pays attention to the conflict. Now, whether this was a conscious decision on Bart's part is likely not the case. Last exit to Springfield. The Springfield nuclear plant is in search of a new union representative, trying to find somebody to negotiate against Mr. Burns on what their new contract should be. The plan is to accept a keg of beer at their meetings in exchange for their dental plan, but when Homer realizes that he'll have to pay for Lisa's braces if the union loses dental, he denounces the new contract, which motivates the workers to elect him head of the union. Unfortunately, or fortunately, Homer doesn't really understand what his responsibilities are, and he winds up vastly misinterpreting Burns' attempts at bribery, which Burns interprets as masterful negotiation tactics. Ultimately, Homer ends up accidentally encouraging the union to strike, which causes the town of Springfield to lose power. But this doesn't discourage anybody, and the union continues their protest until Burns caves and accepts renewing the old one. on the condition that Homer steps down from his position as union president. This episode is perhaps the best at showing both the down-to-earth human struggles of the Simpson family while still maintaining the facetious satire that the series is best known for, all without either theme interfering with the other. The Simpson family is threatened with the loss of their dental plan, a financial fear that anybody can relate to, and yet the means through which they get it back is fraught with humor and pop culture references in a way that comes across as so absurd that it's a genuine shock that it can still be relatable. As long as stories are still human, they can go in any direction, and so Homer can spin around on the floor like a stooge after negotiating the contract without taking away from how much we're rooting for him. This episode combines the biting, relevant satire that the show is capable of with the lowbrow, referential humor that enabled any audience to enjoy its writing, and combined enough elements from daily life that anyone viewing it could relate to the experience. It's the type of thing that a pretentious YouTube video essay writer can enjoy just as much as a media-illiterate average type, bringing the whole country closer together as we get that not much really is different between us. So it's come to this, a Simpsons clip show. Bart is seeking an April Fool's prank to get back at Homer, and ultimately concludes that the best option is to shake up a beer using industrial equipment so it will explode in his face. This works too well, and Homer winds up in the hospital. While there, the Simpson family reminisce on all the various moments through their lives that have tested them in the same way. The rest of the plot is Homer relearning things, such as how to walk, before ultimately recovering to strangle Bart. For a more thorough retelling of this episode's plot, rewatch this series from the beginning. This is a clip show, with the main plot largely existing to facilitate flashbacks using recycled footage. Although some of the footage is unseen, such as the newly revealed footage of Homer falling down the cliff from Bart the Daredevil. That said, this episode doesn't say much about the show overall that hasn't been said before, and was likely made to cheaply and quickly produce an episode. The Front. Upset with the low quality of recent Itchy and Scratchy episodes, Bart and Lisa decide that they should write their own and submit it to the studio. But when it's rejected, they decide to include Abraham Simpson's name on the script instead of their own, so the letter won't be ignored for being from children. This works, and the episode airs, which encourages Itchy and Scratchy Studios to hire Grandpa Simpson as a writer full-time. Bart and Lisa continue pinning episodes under his name, and they're soon nominated for an award. But when the episode plays during the awards show, Abe uses the podium to denounce the cartoon as disgusting and retires from his so-called career then and there. In the B-plot, Homer and Marge attend their high school reunion, where Homer wins several gag awards. But they're all taken away from him when it's revealed that he never finished high school. So he attends night school to obtain a GED, and after a while, graduates properly to get back his Most Improved Odor award. If you can't laugh at yourself, then you don't really deserve to laugh at anybody else, and the Simpsons writers understand this well enough that they can devote an entire episode to making fun of the process of cartoon writing. Whether that's a dig at Ren and Stimpy, whose writer John Kay has denigrated the show before, or a dig at network executives, who have also tried to limit and restrain the show, or a dig at themselves, who have probably been the harshest of anybody towards The Simpsons. A majority of this episode is dedicated to pointing out the absurdity of the behind-the-scenes, while also using the opportunity to make a few other gags about the process of cartooning itself while the subject matter is brought up. In this way, it manages to contain more meta-elements than the previous episode, and that was a clip show. It's fitting that we also get a series of segments involving Krusty during this episode, not only because he's adjacent to the Itchy and Scratchy shorts themselves, but because he's a TV personality within The Simpsons, much in the same way that The Simpsons are TV personalities within our world. So showing off Krusty as a troubled, egotistic individual will always be a joke told at the expense of anybody whose work ends up on television. Whacking Day. After stealing groundskeeper Willie's tractor and running over Superintendent Chalmers, Bart is expelled from Springfield Elementary. After a few failed attempts at enrolling him elsewhere, Marge then decides to homeschool Bart herself. This works, as Bart is soon enthralled by a book Marge read as a child, and he founds a newfound love of reading. Meanwhile, Whacking Day is occurring, a holiday where all the snakes in Springfield are lured into the town center and beaten with blunt instruments. Lisa is disgusted by this practice, but is outnumbered by the Springfieldianites who enjoy it. That is, until she and Bart devise a plan to lure all the snakes into their house with the low baritone of Barry White. And when the mob follows them there, she reveals the truth, that Whacking Day was a sham holiday invented to beat up the Irish. For effective independent learning, Bart is invited back to Springfield Elementary, and everything returns to normal. It's interesting that Bart becomes a model student the moment he's out of Springfield Elementary. It only took one good book and a bit of extra attention for him to really shine in terms of his own education, although this isn't a new idea in The Simpsons. Bart has been shown to have a hidden intellect before, whether it's learning French through exposure or piecing together one of Sideshow Bob's schemes. It's a bit telling that in the impersonal one-size-fits-all approach to education, Bart would get left behind when he's just as capable as Lisa is when it comes to using his head. But nothing ever gets challenged in the town of Springfield, just as much as things aren't challenged in the real world. Even if a system is known to leave many of its participants behind, people are resistant to change when it comes to things that could improve society, just as Springfield itself resists challenges to their tradition of Whacking Day. It's easier for problem students to be swept under the rug, and it's easier for the dark moments of history to be erased, but it's more challenging to wonder why things are the way they are, and convince others as well as yourself that things could be better. Marge in Chains. When a flu strain from Osaka enters the town of Springfield, the whole Simpson family, save for Marge, needs taking care of. In the stress of the moment, Marge accidentally forgets to pay for a bottle of bourbon at the Quickie Mart and is arrested for theft. Her attorney, Lionel Hutz, botches the defense, on top of the entire town turning on Marge as more and more rumors begin to spread about her behavior. Ultimately, she winds up in prison, although she enjoys the time there as she doesn't have to cook or clean up after herself. But while she's away, the Simpson family struggles to keep the house clean without her. Worse still is that the Springfield bake sale can't raise enough money without Marge's contributions to construct a statue of Lincoln as they wanted, and they're forced to settle for a lesser president, Jimmy Carter. His unveiling causes the town to riot, and all of Springfield falls into chaos, only fixed when Marge Simpson is released from jail and all ends well. The plot retreads much of the same ground we've already seen covered in episodes like Homer Alone, where Marge spends time away due to stress and the Simpson family ends up collapsing without her presence. But this episode takes that plot from earlier and increases the stakes and scale by having Marge's absence not only affecting the family, but the entire town. It's the kind of thing that plays into Season 4's overall insistence on exaggerating the familiar satirization of the previous seasons. It still has just enough of a barrier between satire and absurdity so as not to commit to any potentially controversial topics, like the US justice system. And of course, the riot is caused by Springfield's enragement over a statue of who has to be one of the least offensive US presidents. But what this episode is primarily remembered for these days is the quote predictions that it made about the future. The whole town is shut down by a virus, a swarm of murder hornets, rioting in the streets, and a barely functional over-engineered juicer. This follows in the trend of The Simpsons Did It, where major news stories are often dismissed by internet comedians as simply rehashing plots from The Simpsons. Of course, when a show runs for as long as The Simpsons has, it's only natural that certain beats would wind up predating real events. We know the show is borrowed from the real world enough that the reverse would be inevitable. Krusty gets cancelled. A viral advertisement for Gabbo attracts the intrigue of the town of Springfield, which is ultimately revealed to be a kids show involving a puppet airing opposite Krusty the Clown. Gabbo begins stealing ratings from an increasingly desperate Krusty before eventually the clown is dropped from the network for poor ratings. He sulks for a while, but when Bart sabotages Gabbo's reputation by hot-micing a negative remark about Springfield's children after a show, the opportunity arises for Krusty to make a comeback. So he gathers up all of the celebrity acquaintances he's connected with throughout the years, and plans a big special, with the Simpson family helping him to get in shape for his re-debut. The special goes off without a hitch, and Krusty is once again the biggest name in television, except for Johnny Carson. A fan theory revolving around Krusty the Clown that I quite enjoy is something that gets played with a bit in this episode. The general idea is that Krusty the Clown is not trying to host a kids show. Clowns as TV hosts fell out of favor in the early 60s, so the only people who would really get why he was hosting a kids show in the 90s are those who grew up during that time. He regularly throws tantrums on air and accidentally lets slip all of his gambling habits and other vices. That is to say, Krusty the Clown is a terrible clown on purpose. It's all part of the character that he's built up for a decades-long career. That's why he can tell a joke that bombs, but then give genuine comedy advice when it's necessary, as well as why so many celebrities are willing to associate with him despite his outward failings. Krusty the Clown is funny in-universe for the same reason he's funny outside the Simpsons universe. But it's these celebrity guest stars that also bring to light the other side of this episode's appeal. The big names attached to the show are practically a gag in and of themselves. That The Simpsons is such a large hit that they can get practically anyone to appear as themselves is something that, at the time, was considered a sign of its health and cultural relevance. It's not until years later that this same phenomenon would become a sign of the show's decline in quality, although this was still a concern at the time. Julie Kavner, as well as Harry Shearer, were opposed to the number of celebrity guest stars in this episode, believing it to be tasteless and unnecessary, leading to Marge's voice being completely absent from this episode. Season 5. Season 5 marks the departure of the original Simpsons team and is represented by the last bits of relatability being erased from the on-paper plots. While The Simpsons would still have many things that are down to earth, just as before, this is the point where the consensus finally shifted that there shouldn't be a requirement for plots to be human. The characters can go anywhere, do anything, and there's no need to worry about sharks being jumped, as the original showrunners lost their attachments to anything resembling a legacy. This isn't to say that this is an inherently bad thing, though. Ordinarily, jumping the shark is a term used to define the moment where a show ceases to be relatable to its audience, or when the writers ran out of ideas for the show. Jumping the shark often signifies when the quality of writing is no longer what it once was, and that all of the original interest has waned completely. If the writers have exhausted their ideas, then the show is forced to take significantly higher stakes in lieu of whatever made it so great in the first place. And I think that as of Season 5, it's safe to say that The Simpsons has run out of things for the every family of America to do. And as they did so, they were forced to reinvent The Simpsons nearly conceptually. No longer are we getting the greeting card schmaltz of earlier seasons and the stories of your hometown here, but instead the show has become a referential parody of itself. And this is perhaps why The Simpsons has stayed culturally relevant for so long. It began as a refreshing change of pace from the typical sitcom formula, but when that change became the norm, The Simpsons had to adapt in order to stay one step ahead. So instead of satirizing America, why not satirize The Simpsons? Homer's Barbershop Quartet. At the Springfield swap meet, Bart and Lisa stumble upon an old record with their dad's face on it, and so he regales them the tale of the time that he was a member of a barbershop quartet called the B Sharps. It began with him, Chief Wiggum, Principal Skinner, and Apu all singing together at Moe's Cavern when they're scouted by an agent who requires them to drop Wiggum and find someone new. They audition for a while but eventually learn that Barney has a great voice when they find him on the bathroom floor of Moe's. In spite of Chief Wiggum's attempts to get back at the band, they catapult to stardom with their hit Baby on Board, which Homer writes inspired by Lisa. But this newfound fame causes Homer to spend more time away from Marge than he's comfortable with, and she worries that he won't be around to raise their 2 children. This, combined with the band's slow downfall as Barbershop fades from the spotlight, eventually causes the group to disband, and the story to catch up to the modern day. But after reliving the memories, Homer calls up his former companions, and they perform one last concert together on the roof of Moe's. The B Sharps are an homage to the Beatles, with many of the references in this episode being to that particular band. Everything from their career starting at the Cavern Club to many of the defining moments, including an album that referenced John Lennon's "more popular than Jesus" quote, is some sort of reference to the band's various highlights and lowlights. Barney replacing Wiggum references the protest about Ringo replacing Pete Best, and of course, the rooftop concert at the end of the episode was done by the Beatles as well, just with a bit less tear-gassing. And yet all of these references seem to come at the expense of some of the show's continuity. Santa's little helper tries to bury the fake Homer's head in the flashback, but the Simpson family didn't get a dog until the first season. Homer is shown to be bald in the album art, despite having hair, albeit a receding hairline, in the episode. And there are pictures of a fully grown Bart and Lisa in the background of the master bedroom, despite again the episode being a flashback. And while most of this is extreme nitpicking, it goes to show that a later complaint about The Simpsons forgetting its own continuity isn't something exclusive to the later seasons. Cape Feare. Bart receives a series of threatening letters detailing his own death and tries to track down who it is that may be trying to kill him. It turns out to be none other than Sideshow Bob, who has recently had a parole hearing that lets him out of prison and back into the streets of Springfield, where he makes his intentions to gut the boy known. So the Simpson family enters the Witness Relocation Program, and they move to Terror Lake, getting a new life and a new houseboat. But Sideshow Bob follows them to their new home and manages to corner Bart with the rest of the family incapacitated. With some quick thinking, Bart convinces Bob to sing the score of the HMS Pinafore as a last request, which buys enough time for the houseboat to drift back to Springfield, where Bob is once again put behind bars. This episode contains many references to horror movies, from Bob staying in the Bates Motel to multiple visual references of the methods of pop culture killers. But the primary thing referenced in this episode is The Simpsons itself. Bob is a recurring villain, with his multiple appearances in the show being one of the few consistent sources of continuity throughout the show. And while episodes involving him often begin and end with Bob being in jail, they still play off of earlier knowledge of previous episodes to understand fully what kind of dynamic exists between the two. Sideshow Bob can best be described as an affable villain. He's the type who doesn't put much effort into appearing as the bad guy in anything that he does, unless that thing is killing Bart. Then, he becomes a full-on menace, getting not quite German tattoos and writing letters in his own blood. But if Bart were not a threat, Sideshow Bob would likely behave as any other member of polite society might, his murderous tendencies being nothing but a thought in the back of his mind. Homer goes to college. After botching a surprise inspection, Homer is made to go back to college to get the degree that his job requires. He's looking forward to the opportunity, expecting it to be like a lewd college comedy, but when he arrives is horrified to learn that the stereotype of the party college was grossly exaggerated, especially when you're studying nuclear physics. He fails his classes, and the dean recommends that he get tutoring from some of the smarter students, or nerds. Homer befriends the nerds, but after realizing what they are, decides to teach them everything he knows about partying hard. But this backfires when one of their pranks gets the boys expelled. With nowhere else to go, the Simpson family allows the nerds to stay with them, only for their habits to annoy the family to the point that Homer has to come up with a zanier scheme to get the boys back in the dean's good graces. But when this fails, the dean simply accepts them anyway, as he believed he was too harsh on them before. The day of the final exam comes, and despite Homer's last-minute cramming, he fails the test anyway. But the nerds owe him a favor, and they hack into the grading system to change his grade to a passing one, which angers Marge, and she demands he go back to college for real. The Simpsons started out as a parody of typical domestic comedy formulas, parroting tropes but then showing off a more realistic consequence to the antics of the characters. Springfield was the type of town that enabled and even encouraged this sort of behavior for a while, but the parody aspects of The Simpsons began to grow stale once the real-world equivalents fell out of favor. Homer's idea of what college should be like are incompatible with the actual college experience, much in the same way that the type of media parodied in the first 4 seasons was no longer mainstream enough for the stylistic parody to make sense. And so The Simpsons began moving on from that earlier style, adapting to a changing culture by attempting to stay one step ahead and making fun of itself. This episode comes across as very forced, but in a way that makes sense for the plot's development. Homer and Burns' attempts to get the former into college all come up short, yet Homer is simply given an admission anyways. Homer's attempts to get the nerds a wild and crazy college life backfires, and his attempts to get them back in the dean's good graces backfire as well, with the dean simply deciding to give the group what they want. In this way, all of the scheming and hijinks one would expect from a comedy get subverted, but rather than its subversion coming at the end of the gag, it appears exclusively in the middle. Rosebud. Mr. Burns begins losing sleep over the memory of his lost childhood teddy bear, Bobo. In spite of all the things he has, he doesn't feel complete without it, so he puts out advertisements searching for the toy, which happens to end up in the possession of Maggie Simpson. The Simpson family plans on giving him the toy in exchange for a large sum of money, but when the elderly man comes to their house to plan the exchange, Maggie refuses to give the toy away. And so Homer decides that the happiness of his youngest daughter is more valuable than any amount of money that Burns could give to them. But Mr. Burns refuses to accept this outcome, and after a few failed attempts at burglary, decides to take over every TV channel and divert every delivery of beer into Springfield in order to turn the townsfolk against Homer. But when this fails, he ultimately decides to give the bear a goodbye, telling Maggie to love the bear as much as he once did, and with this show of affection, Maggie finally decides to give the bear away for free. Less subtext and more plain text is the fact that Bobo is meant to represent Mr. Burns' lost childhood innocence, which comes around to be the reason that he's so hesitant to simply force the toy away from Maggie. To strip away that innocence from another through a cruel action wouldn't bring back what it is that he's searching for, and so Bobo can only be obtained through legitimate means, otherwise the bear represents nothing. This episode is ultimately more of a Mr. Burns episode than it is about any of the Simpsons in particular. While Homer is the one with the most agency among the family, and Maggie is the one who ultimately serves as a roadblock to the episode wrapping up earlier, Mr. Burns is the one to undergo an arc, and is the only one who gets a majority of the decision-making moments in the episode. Fitting in that it's a lengthy homage to Citizen Kane, the third homage episode of a season that we're only 4 episodes into. Treehouse of Horror IV. Bart guides the audience through a museum that he claims is haunted, each painting serving as a window into some twisted story, or maybe they just threw something together with vampires. The first tale is The Devil and Homer Simpson. Homer daydreams for too long and misses out on the last donut at work. When he announces out loud that he'd sell his soul for a donut, the devil, Ned Flanders, appears and offers to facilitate the exchange. And although Homer thinks he's outsmarted the devil for a bit by not finishing the snack, his sleepwalking gets the better of him, and he soon finishes the forbidden donut. He's taken to a hellish court after an evening in the underworld, and the devil stacks the jury. But despite the incompetence of their hired lawyer, Marge finds an old wedding photo with the message on the back where Homer pledges her his eternal soul. In the end, the jury decrees that Homer's soul wasn't his to give away, and the deal with the devil is void, so Flanders curses Homer to wear the donut as his head for eternity. The second short is Terror at 5.5 feet. Bart has a nightmare about a bus crash and fears going to school that day. Despite Lisa's attempts to assuage him, he soon finds that his fears are valid when a gremlin appears on the side of the bus, tearing at the mechanics. His pleas to stop the bus fall on deaf ears, as every time he convinces people to look outside, the gremlin is gone. Ultimately, Bart takes matters into his own hands by opening the bus window and attacking the gremlin himself, which gets him taken to an asylum once the bus arrives at its destination. Despite the clear damage to the side of the bus, they still decide his behavior was unwarranted and haul him off anyway, with the gremlin following. The third story is Bart Simpson's Dracula. Mr. Burns invites the family to his mansion in Pennsylvania during a slew of bloody killings. Lisa is wary of potential dangers, wariness that's warranted when Mr. Burns does indeed capture and turn Bart into a member of his undead army. When Homer learns of Bart becoming a vampire, he decides to live out the American dream and kill his boss, breaking into the mansion and stabbing Burns to death. But it turns out that he wasn't in fact the head vampire. That honor was Marge's, as she has a life outside the house. The episode ends with an homage to Charlie Brown's Christmas special. Marge on the Lam. When Homer gets both of his arms stuck in vending machines, he can't take Marge to the ballet like he promised, so Marge goes with Ruth Powers, their next-door neighbor from last season, instead. The The two have a great time together, prompting Marge to want to go out with her again the next night. Homer grows jealous of his wife's new social life and decides to enjoy time out as well, leaving the kids to be taken care of by Lionel Hutz. But Homer can't find anything enjoyable to do and ends up hitching a ride home from Chief Wiggum, who happens upon Marge and Ruth on the highway where he moves to pull them over. Ruth reveals that the car is stolen and a chase begins, with Marge initially hoping not to get involved, but ultimately doing a bit of soul-searching that leads her back to her new friend. In the end, an impassioned apology from Homer causes Marge to realize that she doesn't need to abandon her old life for a new one, and Ruth accepts her fate. Ruth Powers doesn't play a significant role in any plot for several seasons after this, her part in the show slowly fading with time as she becomes mostly irrelevant. Many other Simpsons characters evolve from background assets to one-off gags to full-blown personas as more plots are written with them in mind to fill the positions. But Ruth Powers never makes the cut. This is likely because her niche as the bitter ex-wife to an unmet and unnamed husband is something that there just isn't much of a demand for, considering that there are already two much more developed characters that can be used for single-woman plots in Selma and Miss Krabappel. So Ruth gets sidelined not because she's uninteresting, but because she's not distinct. This episode deals with Homer's insecurities that Marge may become a character distinct from the Simpson household as she spends more and more time away from it. It's not exactly in plain text that this is his anxiety, but the fact that Marge is such a non-character despite having so many appearances in the show up to this point is something that would eventually need some attention brought to it, and this episode is the first to do so that doesn't just point out that she's stressed due to her housewife responsibilities. While the conclusion is ultimately that she should be grateful for the relationship she has, this isn't much of a surprise, as character development is something that, by now, is established to get in the way of continuity. Bart's inner child. Acting on impulse, Homer gets a trampoline and charges children from the neighborhood to play on it. But this causes a series of injuries, just as Marge anticipated that it would, and Homer is forced to get rid of the plaything. But after doing so, he points out that Marge shuts down any fun thing he tries to do, and that she's a bit of a nag, something corroborated by their children. She goes to her sister's to unwind, and there is given the advice to see a self-help guru named Brad Goodman. They attend a seminar where Bart starts to heckle the man, but rather than being annoyed, he views Bart's antics as a sign of an emotionally healthy young man, and praises Marge and Homer's parenting style. He then tells the town of Springfield that they should act more like Bart, and they begin to live a carefree, rebellious lifestyle. Bart gets upset that his slacker identity has been co-opted around the time that Springfield throws a Do What You Feel festival. But this festival turns into a Rube Goldberg machine of disaster, and the whole incident is blamed on Bart, who barely escapes their ire. In the end, Lisa points out that self-improvement is a slow process achievable by anyone, a lesson that's ignored for the Simpsons to watch TV. Bartmania took over the Western world so quickly that it's hardly a surprise that a show satirizing Western culture would eventually be forced to take a stab at it to be relevant. This is one of the most meta episodes of the show, and that's including clip show episodes. Be Like Boy takes the town of Springfield much in the same way that The Simpsons rose to popularity, and the effect was largely the same. Those who were annoyed by the trend overtaking everything else in culture were quick to place the blame on the inspiration for the behavior rather than those doing it, and The Simpsons came under scrutiny from people who couldn't be bothered to police what their children consumed. This episode also briefly touches on Bart's anxiety that he's lost a part of who he is when the whole town starts to imitate him. As Lisa points out, defining yourself by rebellion only works when your actions are genuinely going against the grain of society. Once counterculture becomes culture, you cease to stand out and have to either accept conformity or seek to reinvent yourself. Much in the same way that The Simpsons started out as a denouncement of pop culture's schlock, it soon became the standard as other shows started to imitate the style, and The Simpsons was forced to metamorphosize in order to stay as relevant as it wanted to. Boy-Scouts in the Hood. Bart and Milhouse receive a $20 bill through an act of God, and Homer's incompetence, which they use to buy an all-syrup squishy, sending them on a bender throughout the town of Springfield. The next morning, Bart wakes up in the uniform of the Junior Campers. He plans on quitting the next day, but when he learns that the junior campers can get out of school and carry a knife around, he decides to stick around to see what other benefits it might have. This culminates in a father-son rafting trip, where Homer and Bart get paired up with the Flanderses. Homer later gets the group lost at sea, and his continued ineptitude makes the situation worse and worse until they're out of food and fresh water with the hole in the raft. But Homer's nose saves the day when he smells hamburgers in the distance, and they come across a Krusty Burger store and an oil rig. Homer's intelligence is something that varies wildly throughout the show, something even lampshaded by the writers themselves in later seasons. While he's never been shown to be especially intelligent, his stupidity increases steadily as the episodes go on and eventually get to the point of absurdity. At first, Homer was meant to be an everyman to stand in for the typical American. As such, he was often meant to be just slightly dumber than the average viewer, as is typical of the trope. Things would be explained to him as often as it would to the audience, and he could never be one step ahead of the people watching at home. But this aspect of his character got exaggerated as time went on, and writers turned over, and eventually we got the Homer that we see in the 2020s as early as now. While it's Homer's brain that gets the boys into the rough situation they're in, it's his stomach that gets him out of it. Like many plots before, this is one where a character's actions are forgiven due to some last-second actions that act as a redemption, meaning that all is well, with the initial harm being forgiven due to everything having a happy ending. In this situation, though, Homer ruining the rafting trip is actually something that Bart anticipates from the outset, as if Homer putting the family in life-or-death situations is something so common that it's to be expected. In this case, the act of saving them is actually something that put Homer karmically ahead due to acting better than expected. A telling sign of his steadily decreasing competence that this is now the norm. The Last Temptation of Homer. Due to a variety of labor law violations, Burns is forced to hire a female employee. The role is filled by Mindy Simmons, who has a degree in engineering or something. But more importantly, she seems to be an exact match for Homer, who quickly grows infatuated with her. He tries to ignore her and to prove that the attraction is purely physical, but this only makes the two fall for each other even more. Soon, they're sent on a company trip to represent the plant at an energy summit where they get plenty of time alone together. Homer fears that he's going to be tempted to cheat on Marge, but in the end, he resists that urge by calling Marge into Capital City instead. In the B-plot, Bart realizes that he may have a vision problem, and so Marge takes him to the doctor for a pair of prescription glasses. While there, he's also fitted with a variety of medical devices that turn him into the stereotypical nerd, drawing the attention of the schoolyard bullies. After 2 weeks are over and he no longer needs the devices, he triumphantly returns to school, only to get beaten up anyway. This episode briefly posits that Bart's behavioral issues and lacking grades are a result of an undiagnosed vision problem, despite earlier in the episode showing once again that he's great at applying himself to things like subtle pranks or his various other forms of mischief. But this aspect isn't given too much credence, especially considering that he's never shown performing in class again while his vision is corrected to prove that statement one way or another. And yet that whole discussion is irrelevant to the kids of Springfield Elementary anyway, as they bully Bart purely for his physical appearance rather than any aspect of his personality. Then, once he's back to normal, he still gets beaten up, this time because he tempted fate and made himself stand out. The A-plot of this episode deals with Homer being afraid that he may wind up being unfaithful to Marge, a huge departure from a recent episode with similar themes, Colonel Homer. In that episode, he was close to unfaithfulness without realizing the hurt it caused for his wife. But here, he resists the temptation due to that very same potential. It's interesting that while Homer is getting dumber every season, he seems to at least be slightly more aware of the feelings of his significant other. If you can't replicate the plots you once could, the writers are aware that they can substitute them out for more relatability in their schmaltz. Springfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling. In order to reverse an economic downturn in Springfield, the town agrees to legalize gambling. Mr. Burns opens a casino, and soon the entire town is enthralled with giving away even more of their money to him. Homer gets a job at a table, though his inability to count makes him one of the most popular dealers. Marge gets addicted to gambling, neglecting her responsibilities to her family, such as Lisa, who has to attend a school pageant in a Florida costume made by Homer, and Bart, who opens his own casino in his treehouse. After Homer realizes how much their household is falling apart without Marge, he convinces her that her gambling is causing issues, and she agrees to stop. Meanwhile, Mr. Burns grows increasingly alienated and paranoid of germs as more and more people visit the casino. In terms of actual plot, this episode runs extremely thin. It's as if the concept was, Springfield gets a casino, run with that for 22 minutes. It's as though there was hardly any attempt to tell a story at all. Marge slowly abandons her family for gambling, but only needs Homer to run in and point out that fact to her to get her to stop. His previous attempts at doing so, all foiled by him getting distracted by something else. Mr. Burns slowly becomes more jaded and paranoid as the episode progresses, but this isn't really prompted by anything. It's more so to reference Howard Hughes, and it's a plot point that gets resolved very quickly because he misses his old job. And Bart's Casino doesn't even get wrapped up. The story ends with Robert Goulet performing while it's at the height of its popularity. And yet, in spite of all of that, this episode is still one of the most well-regarded of the Oakley-Weinstein era. The actual plot of many of the more absurd Simpsons episodes ultimately doesn't matter. It doesn't take some grand machination to pry the family apart in order to have a heartwarming reunion at the end. It can be a minor contrivance and the effect is still the same. Likewise with humor. So long as there's the bare minimum of a story to provide context, The Simpsons doesn't need a plot to carry any of its jokes. Homer the Vigilante. A string of robberies occurs in the town of Springfield and the police are powerless to figure out who the culprit is. Upon a wave of paranoia, Homer and a few of his neighbors form a neighborhood watch, gathering their firearms and preparing to patrol the neighborhood for safety. But rather than actually making any progress on catching the cat burglar, they instead terrorize the regular townsfolk and go mad with power. Eventually, the thief announces his intentions to steal a priceless gem from the Springfield Museum, which prompts the watch to guard it overnight. Though this is to no success as the zirconia is stolen anyway. But Grandpa Simpson happens to witness the burglary happening and tattles on the thief Malloy, a new member of the retirement community. He's arrested after returning all the stolen items, but reveals that the money he's made over several years is stashed away in Springfield itself, causing a mad dash to find it, during which he escapes from the unguarded cell. A major theme throughout this episode is set up within the narrative as a sort of anti-ageist crusade, that the elderly aren't simply bystanders, too useless to be of any help to the communities in which they live. Though this messaging is actually pretty flimsy, as there's not really any point to the actual experience of the elderly that helps to solve the mystery in the end, or give an edge to Malloy, except maybe the fact that he can use his age as a refuge from scrutiny, that nobody might suspect an old man of outsmarting the entire town. But the real messaging behind this episode comes down more to waves of panic, and how these can cause much more harm than whatever the source of that panic is. The neighborhood watch commits far more crime than they actually stop, and the sense of panic that's overwhelmed Springfield is only made worse by their power-hungry patrols. In the end, the mob is a bigger threat to safety and community than the actual cat burglar, and this is something that gets weaponized when Malloy uses the townsfolk's greed as a distraction to escape. Bart Gets Famous. Bart's class goes to a box factory, a field trip so boring that Bart sneaks out and heads to a Channel 6 lot across the street. He wanders around backstage and manages to fumble his way into an assistant position with Krusty the Clown. He's excited about the spot at first, but mistreatment by the cast members and the constant working hours cause him to get disillusioned with the work. That is, until Bart is pulled on stage for a quick spot in a sketch where he knocks over the scenery and says, "I didn't do it." This catapults him into fame as the I Didn't Do It Kid, and he's soon one of the most famous breakout characters in the country. But just as quickly as his fame starts to wear him out, he falls out of popular culture, and before long Bart is kicked out of show business, returning to his own life. The brevity of Bart's tenure in the show business perhaps shows a potential insecurity that the Simpsons writing staff has about their very similar role in pop culture. His fame comes from a flash-in-the-pan sort of popularity, the kind of thing that gets a lot of attention in a very short amount of time and disappears just as quickly. It's not as though Bart is in a particularly unique case. This sort of thing appears very often in culture, and they've all faded from time. So when Krusty props up Bart's fame for a quick buck, he has to know that it's a temporary fad, the kind of thing you need to capitalize on while it's still profitable. He knew from the beginning that Bart's career wouldn't last, and maybe this is something that the Simpsons feared would happen to them as soon as they stopped bringing in revenue for Fox. Bart tries to reinvent himself, to prove that he's more than a single catchphrase, but the world doesn't care. They're not looking for a variety act, there are already so many of those. They want the cheap laugh and then to move on. We see the same thing occurring in the writing staff as we see on the screen. So much of the staff is turned over in between seasons that the newcomers surely had to be a bit unsure whether they'd be able to live up to the enormous hype placed onto their work, or if the original staff was leaving because they recognized that it was no longer there. Homer and Apu. After Homer gets food poisoning twice from the Quickie Mart, he calls into a consumer protection hotline where he's given an opportunity to wear a hidden camera to catch Apu in the act of selling expired goods. When this works, Apu is fired from his job and replaced by Hollywood actor James Woods. Rather than letting himself feel down about the incident, Apu decides to apologize for poisoning Homer in the first place by living with the Simpson family and improving their quality of life. But he can't find real fulfillment there, and so he and Homer make the trek to the CEO of Quickie Mart to ask for his job back. When this too fails, he returns to his original workplace just as it's being robbed. When Apu takes a bullet for James Woods, the latter is so grateful that he decides to pull some strings and get Apu his old career back. It's interesting to note that in this episode, Apu is fired for poisoning Homer and price gouging the rest of Springfield for years, something that makes his downfall seem inevitable in some way. And yet a character like Mr. Burns doing the same thing for decades is shown as just another ordinary part of life in Springfield and thus in America. Had Apu been just a little bit richer, he could have continued on with his misdeeds, avoiding liability for his actions for as long as he could afford the team of lawyers to cover himself. But at the end of the day, the ironic part about the entire situation is the fact that, unlike the nuclear plant, the people of Springfield have more choice in avoiding shopping at Quickie Mart. There are other grocery stores shown in this episode and throughout the rest of the show, but the Simpson family chooses to continue patronizing the very store that's been harming them, putting a bit of the impetus for their harm on themselves. And so the irony comes from the fact that if you can choose who's poisoning you, you get the option to fire back, but if that choice is made for you, you're powerless. Lisa versus Malibu Stacy. Feeling like he's too old for society, Abe Simpson decides to give the family their inheritance early so that he might live to see them enjoy it. They immediately blow him off to go spend the money, which makes Grandpa realize that nobody likes him due to his age. He resolves to get back into the real world by getting a job, only for the pace of the work and technology involved to baffle him, and leave him behind even further. Eventually, Abe realizes that he doesn't belong in the working world, but rather he should be on the other side, complaining with the rest of the old folks. In the A-plot, Lisa buys the new talking Malibu Stacy doll, only to be disgusted by the regressive stereotypes she spouts. So Lisa tracks down the reclusive founder of Malibu Stacy, Stacy Lovell, with the plan to create their own line of dolls that's more socially progressive. But the corporation behind the dolls tries to sabotage their new line, fearing it may turn their target audience less consumerist, and they release a new mainline entry to direct attention away from Lisa Lionheart. As willing as The Simpsons has always been to point out the absurdities in everyday life, the show was far from offering genuine solutions to what it complained about, much in the same vein as the shows it riffed on. Often, when a show portrays a societal issue, the issue is merely set dressing or a background element, and the navigation of that issue is about adaptation, or seeking help from those closest to you. And while these are realistic and relatable goals to strive for, The Simpsons takes it one step beyond, and actively challenges these ideals by proposing not so much a solution to a societal issue, but positing that solution should be strived for in the first place. It isn't just a matter of Lisa trying to find her own way in a society that increasingly tries to commodify stereotypes, but that she's challenging the fact that this sort of societal norm exists in the first place. Back in the 90s, this was a more controversial idea than it is now, and it's actually very reassuring to see that an episode like this has aged poorly, purely in the sense that Lisa would no longer be viewed as an outcast for trying to fight against gender norms. Deep Space Homer. When Homer loses Employee of the Week to an inanimate carbon rod, he starts to feel as though he doesn't get enough respect at work or at home. At around the same time, NASA fears losing its funding due to poor public interest in spacefair, so they come up with the gimmick of sending a blue-collar worker into space in order to drum up more interest. And they narrow their search to Homer and Barney after the former makes an angry call into their HQ. The total alcohol ban inside NASA grounds causes Barney to become the ideal astronaut, but he's ultimately not sent due to a relapse at the last minute, with Homer going in instead. The launch is successful at first, but due to an incident involving a smuggled bag of chips and a broken ant farm, the equipment is damaged, and later the hatch is broken open, leaving the crew aboard at risk of burning up during re-entry. But Homer accidentally holds it shut with an inanimate carbon rod, and the rod holds, giving it glory upon the ship's return. Homer traveling into space was the internal moment that The Simpsons, quote, jumped the shark in terms of what plots were capable of doing. The last vestige of old Simpsons disappeared as soon as the relatable everyman main character was sent into space, something which no average American would ever realistically view themselves as being able to achieve. While plots have always been a bit larger than life in order to sell the appeal narratively, this is the point where plots started to be separate from real life altogether. The only thread connecting The Simpsons to its roots were the character moments, but even these start to fade once the setting is obscured enough from the audience. It's not as though you can't have deeply personal stories in an alien setting. This episode references Star Trek multiple times, a series famous for doing just that, but it was clear that the humanity of the cast was no longer the primary appeal of the show. Once again, I have to clarify that this is not a bad thing. Many of the greatest all-time episodes of The Simpsons are still in its future from this point, but these are episodes made following the show's complete restructuring of itself. Homer loves Flanders. After trying and failing to get tickets to a football game, Homer begrudgingly goes with Ned Flanders and winds up having a great time. Following this, he declares Ned Flanders to be his best friend, and begins actively trying to spend more and more time with him. But Homer's personality is just as abrasive as always, and he begins to get on Ned's nerves, made worse when the families go on a weekend trip together, where Homer starts a food fight and trashes Ned's car. So Ned starts trying to avoid Homer in public, only to end up getting pulled over for speeding in front of the whole congregation. His reputation ruined, he finds himself unable to face going to church and dealing with further scrutiny from the other churchgoers. But an impassioned speech defending Ned's best qualities from Homer causes the town of Springfield to realize their wrongs, and the two go back to being friends, only for Homer to forget the entire thing the next week. The point of this episode is inverting the typical Ned-Homer dynamic by having Homer become obsessed with loving his neighbor instead of the inexplicable hatred, though a total inversion isn't quite the end result, because while Ned does start to become the more reviled of the two by the community, this is still largely outward appearance. Homer is praised for his charity work, even though he was only trying to get out of helping the poor, and Ned is viewed as being hopped up on goofballs, even though he was just rattled from Homer's antics. Their personalities stay the same, but society views them different anyway, and this is because of Homer latching onto Ned in a more public way than before. All of this to show that Homer is a worse person to have as a friend than as an enemy, because being Homer's enemy doesn't come with an especially large number of downsides due to Homer's general incompetence when it comes to inflicting harm on others. The only thing that protects the groups he dislikes is his apathy, but when he loves somebody or something, he spends much more time around them, to the point that they can actively suffer from association. Homer is a magnetic force for negativity, and the only way to avoid it is for him to avoid you. Bart gets an elephant. Bart wins a radio call-in show with the choice of either receiving $10,000 or an elephant. But rather than taking the money as everybody expected him to do, he accepts the gag prize, which the radio DJs don't have. After a series of angry letters and pressure from their parent company, they finally oblige and drop the elephant off at the Simpsons' front door, only for the family to rapidly realize that they cannot take care of an elephant. Despite this, Bart still loves his pet elephant, naming it Stampy and sleeping outside with him. As the bills pile up, Homer is forced to accept that they need to give Stampy away, and the choice comes down to an ivory dealer or an animal sanctuary. Homer wants to sell to the dealer, due to the sanctuary being a non-profit and offering no money. So Bart releases Stampy into the town, where the elephant stomps around for a while, before ultimately winding up at the Springfield tar pits, longing to return to its kind. In the end, the elephant saves Homer's life, enough to convince him to give the elephant away. This episode's plot comes from a real event where a contestant on The Price is Right turned down a $4,000 prize for an elephant, something the studio later gave to them. All The Simpsons did is adjust the figure for inflation and add a few follow-up scenes to show why the comedic story is a bad idea in the first place, something plain to see just from hearing the outline once. This is par for the course as far as comedic plotlines go. Nothing especially extreme needs to happen when the episode starts off with an absurd premise, and the legwork of getting to that point can be expedited when you're pulling from headlines, as believability is something culture has taken care of for you. This episode ultimately had to have a pretty short plot. Not too much can happen with the conceit of Bart gets an elephant that the title doesn't already make clear. Over half the plot involving the elephant is the family trying to figure out the best way to get rid of it, and the first third of the episode is a plot about the family cleaning the house, with no later connection to the rest of the story. It makes sense. It's hard to characterize an animal of that size, made more difficult by the fact that it's guaranteed not to last until the end of the episode. Burns' Heir. After a near-death experience, Mr. Burns seeks out an heir to leave his fortune to, and ideally to train as his adoptive son. The whole town of Springfield comes out to audition, but none of them make the cut. That is, until Bart begins throwing rocks through the windows of Mr. Burns' mansion, and the man realizes that Bart will make for an ideal heir after all. He spends the next few days spoiling the boy, giving him whatever he wants, and soon, Bart no longer wishes to spend time with his real family. The Simpsons attempt to win back Bart, but none of their attempts succeed despite Bart steadily becoming more and more disillusioned with life under Mr. Burns. Eventually he gives in entirely to the man's influence, and so the head of the nuclear plant has the boy fire his own father as a test of loyalty. But Bart can't go through with it, and he dumps Burns instead, reuniting with the Simpsons at last. Throughout his life, Mr. Burns has always chosen the pursuit of money and power over anything else, including social connections and any sense of community. In this episode, he offers Bart a glimpse into a similar world to what he has, giving the boy a chance to forsake his social connections for wealth. The temptation works for a time, giving Burns the satisfaction of having purchased love, but the only type of love he can buy isn't a love of himself, but a love of his things and the wealth behind them. This is, to Mr. Burns, indistinguishable from the real thing, as he himself has only ever valued a person for their financials and looks down upon anyone whose wealth doesn't match his own. But just as much as his wealth fails to buy him happiness, the thing that wealth attracts won't patch up the holes missing in his life, and he ends the episode doomed to the same isolation as he had to start with. And the Simpson family goes through an opposite arc. They at first want a share of Mr. Burns' wealth. Even Lisa goes on stage to argue her case when she's often the moral compass of the cast. But by the end of the episode they realize that no amount of wealth comes out to a fair amount for the affection of their son, and they desperately try to get Bart back, efforts which were pointless as he returned on his own in his own time, just tying together how much the morals of this episode reflect one another. Sweet Seymour Skinner's Badass Song. When Bart is searching for a last-minute object for show and tell, he settles on bringing Santa's little helper to school. The dog is a hit, but when it's time to return to class, he leaves SLH in a closet where the dog eventually smells the cafeteria and sneaks into the vents. The ensuing property damage results in a surprise visit from Superintendent Chalmers, who reacts to a greased Scotsman by firing Skinner. He's replaced by Ned Flanders, who goes too easy on the children, and chaos breaks out in the classrooms, all because of Bart's actions. But instead of feeling ecstatic at the firing of his mortal enemy, Bart instead feels a sense of guilt that Seymour lost his job, with the former principal rejoining the army, as it was the only other place where he felt he belonged. Bart eventually realizes that he needs Skinner back in his life as a rival, and gets Ned fired by showing Chalmers that he's trying to pray in school. Skinner gets his job back, and the duo return to their old ways. The 100th episode of The Simpsons, an arbitrary milestone that wasn't even originally meant to be this episode. The 100th episode produced wouldn't be until Lisa's Rival, which doesn't air until season 6. But this episode was chosen to be the 100th in syndication as it heavily featured Bart, the most popular character at the time. Advertisements were run promising that this would be Bart's greatest prank yet, a sign of how misunderstood the show could still manage to be with executives. And of course, the chalkboard gag from this episode shows the staff's real opinions on the overall milestone. When episodes are made in overlapping schedules, it's difficult to really pin down a feeling for an individual work, as they all seem to blend together. For all the fanfare surrounding Sweet Seymour Skinner's badass song, very little of it was internal. And why should it be? This episode plays its plots like any other episode of the same era. Rather than a more straightforward story being told about what-if character in situation, the showrunners were prepared to begin asking questions about the very structure of the show, putting character dynamics in the spotlight and stressing their relationships to see what changes to the dynamic worked and what they said about those relationships. As it turns out, Bart and Seymour work well as polar opposites, something now as clear to the audience as it always has been for the writers. The Boy Who Knew Too Much. Bart decides to play hooky one day, enjoying the pleasant weather and skipping out on some of the school's more obnoxious policies. But Principal Skinner tracks him down and chases him to the highway, where Bart takes refuge in the convertible of Freddie Quimby, the miscreant nephew of Mayor Quimby. There, he sneaks into the back rooms of the socialite's 18th birthday party, where he witnesses an argument between the waiter and Freddie, resulting in the waiter being maimed. A trial is held to account for the guilt of Freddie in the assault case, with Bart being the only potential witness. But he's afraid to confess as he had been playing hooky that day and doesn't want to get into trouble. The jury, as well as the court of public opinion, is holding Freddie Quimby guilty, save for Homer, who is intentionally deadlocking the jury in order to get a free hotel room. And as the guilt weighs more and more heavily on Bart, he eventually decides to testify to Freddie's innocence, that the waiter was injured through an accident and that Quimby did nothing wrong. This episode combines the typical moral conundrum that would be common to see in sitcoms of the era with that extra little bit of Simpsons style that simultaneously adds complexity to the situation while also vastly lowering the stakes. Freddie Quimby is the type of person that everybody in Springfield was assumed to be guilty from the outset. Surely, the type of person who's guilty in spirit if not action. And this is usually something you see presented from the other side of the country's wealth gap. In the movie 12 Angry Men, you have a young man accused of a crime and assumed to be guilty due to his position at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Here, the same hatred is given looking up than it would be looking down. And maybe there's something to be said for the clear comparison this episode tries to draw between Freddie and Bart. Freddie brags about getting his girl, his car, and his wealth from dropping out of the 4th grade, the exact line that finally convinces Bart to skip school. The antics of the socialite are perhaps meant to be put into the same framing as Bart's common misbehavior, and so this episode has Bart vouching for the innocence of a future version of himself rather than a stranger, albeit this future vision is one where he lives a lifestyle that the real Bart can never know. Lady Bouvier's lover. Realizing how lonely Jacqueline Bouvier and Abraham Simpson are during Maggie's first birthday party, Marge decides to get the two of them out together so they can enjoy a regular social life. But this works too well, and the two single elders fall in love. They go out together for a while, but soon Miss Bouvier is swept away by Montgomery Burns, who is able to win her over with his wealth, as she's looking for a person who can provide. But Mr. Burns is a cruel and spiteful person, something which gives Marge's mother a bit of hesitation when it comes to marrying. And on the day of the wedding, Abe Simpson crashes the event. He pleads for Jacqueline to reconsider her marriage, and she agrees that she doesn't want to become Miss Monty Burns, nor does she want to marry Grandpa Simpson, which is good enough for him. In the B-plot, Bart buys an original cell from Itchy and Scratchy for $350 of Homer's money. But when he's upset by the end result, he simply extorts Mr. Burns for the cash to pay Homer back. It's a bit interesting the way that the elderly in The Simpsons are always portrayed as perpetually complaining about the way the world is, while simultaneously the show itself is inherently about airing very similar complaints about the state of the world. The denigration the show tends to show towards the elderly is a bit hypocritical in this way, as though the way that Abraham Simpson complains is somehow lesser than the typical satire the show has. But an episode like this humanizing the older cast of the show can help to downplay some of that hypocrisy by showing the deeper needs and desires of many of the show's regular characters. Giving Grandpa Simpson and Grandma Bouvier a bit of extra depth helps to pull them just a bit further from being one-note gags and into the realm of relevance, making all that they say just a bit more good-natured. And that's fundamentally what The Simpsons' relevance comes down to. As much as it makes fun of so many elements of our society, it never does so in a way that looks down on anyone. While they can laugh in the face of the absurd elements of our culture, it always comes across as laughing with America instead of at it, to show that they're able to humanize a group respectfully, just as easily as they can taunt that same group. It makes the laughs all feel a bit more deserved. Secrets of a Successful Marriage. When Homer is called slow by both his friends and family, he takes the advice of Marge to attend adult education classes in order to remedy the situation. But while there, he notices the amount of respect that teachers receive and comes up with the idea to teach a course on the secrets of a successful marriage. But due to not really knowing why his marriage works, he ends up only being able to hold the attention of his class by revealing secrets about his own marriage instead. This gossip spreads across the town, culminating in Homer's class sitting in on a family dinner, causing Marge to kick everybody out, including Homer. Homer moves into Bart's treehouse in the meantime, while he makes multiple attempts to win her back. But the thing that wins her over in the end isn't some secret thing he can give her, but rather complete and total dependence on her for survival. Marge takes Homer back, with the latter knowing that he can't afford to live without her. Perhaps one of the greatest subversions that The Simpsons has ever made in terms of the typical cliches of domestic comedies comes in the ending to this episode. Homer is ultimately unable to come up with anything to give him the typical happy ending that an audience would normally expect, getting the episode a conclusion instead through his own sense of inferiority. While most shows would have some sappy romantic conclusion, this episode ends with a sad display from its main character, followed by an implication that Marge is going to remain in the unhappy situation that caused her to separate from Homer in the first place. Because of course the conclusion of this episode will be forgotten about. It's The Simpsons. There's no continuity, there's no learning, there's no progression. If Homer claims to have learned anything about his marriage, it'll be forgotten about the next time it's convenient to do so for the plot. The only question raised here is about why Marge stays with Homer in the first place, and this all comes down to the fact that Homer is more of a character than Marge is. The Simpsons is a show about the worst traits and aspects of Western society, and so the more often a character is given stuff to do, the more negative traits they get to show. Marge comes across as a better person than Homer purely because we see her less. In this case, her morality is saved by being in the background. Season 6. Season 5 had a rather abrupt ending due to the 1994 Northridge earthquake, something that damaged Film Roman's studio and required production to continue at a satellite facility. This had the result of delaying production by about a month and pushing a few of the episodes originally intended for Season 5 to be aired as an early part of Season 6, as well as another clip show episode intended to fill out missing airtime. But following a recovery, The Simpsons went right back into its previous stride, continuing on in the same direction following a tumultuous 5th season full of restaffing and shifting direction. While the previous season can be considered a time of shark jumping and over-the-top set pieces, Season 6 brought the show back down to earth while keeping those same lofty ideals. Homer won't go to space this season, but that doesn't mean that the domestic antics won't have the same absurd vibes. Season 6 perhaps shows a better mastery at handling the iconic American family. The previous season's grand comedy kept the show afloat with pushing the envelope of how far The Simpsons could possibly go while keeping things interesting. But now that the writers have a better understanding of what they're doing, such things aren't needed. If we want the Simpson family to have one of their classic adventures, there's no need to take them to space to make a memorable moment. A majority of Season 6 takes place within the town of Springfield itself, the plots dealing with more interpersonal issues than before, and pushing the limits of the characters rather than those of the world. As a result, the following season is able to stand out as one of the most canon-establishing seasons since the very first. Our look into the lives of the Simpsons beginning to reflect less on America and more on the Simpsons. Bart of Darkness. On a particularly hot summer day, the Simpsons kids are teased with a pool-mobile, which causes Bart and Lisa to pressure Homer into buying a swimming pool. After assembling it in their backyard, Bart and Lisa quickly become the most popular kids in the neighborhood, as every child nearby comes over to swim. But Bart breaks his leg falling from his treehouse and has to spend the summer in a cast, his friends ignoring him in favor of the pool. Meanwhile, Lisa is too distracted by her newfound popularity to spend time with Bart, and so she gives him a telescope out of pity, which Bart uses to spy on his neighbors. But while doing this, he notices Ned Flanders acting suspicious, as if he had just murdered his wife. Lisa loses her popularity to Martin after the latter gets his own pool installed, and so she ends up with plenty of time to assist Bart's investigation, resulting in her getting trapped in the attic of the suspected murderer. But as it turns out, Ned didn't murder his wife, but rather overwatered her ficus plant, and Bart caught him destroying the evidence. As Bart spends more and more time in his room, unable to enjoy his summer break with the rest of the children, he becomes more and more jaded, until eventually seeking out other sources of entertainment. And with Krusty running reruns, he's forced to come up with his own stories. This starts out as an affinity for writing plays, which Lisa teases him for, but as this fails to satisfy him, he turns instead to coming up with stories about real people, namely Ned Flanders. This boredom, combined with his imagination, causes him to seek out adversity where there is none, and Bart accuses an innocent man of murdering his wife. And while this would normally be the type of thing dismissed by others as being implausible, everyone else is too busy with the same distractions that once held Bart's attention to talk him out of his own head. Especially Lisa, who, after a short taste of popularity, turns off her brain in an attempt to better fit in with others, something that likely causes her to cease being logical when riled up by the same forces that caused Bart to go off the deep end himself. Lisa's rival. A new student arrives in Lisa's class, Allison Taylor. She's better at saxophone, smarter, and skipped a grade, making her younger than Lisa as well. So the Simpson tries to compete with this new student, one-upping her in things like band auditions, but fails to compete. Her next plan is to befriend Allison, but when she arrives at the girl's house and sees her better trophies and better family, Lisa grows jealous and is able to be convinced by Bart to sabotage her at the Diorama-Rama. Lisa swaps Allison's display with the much worse one, in order to finally get her vengeance. But the guilt of doing so takes over, and Lisa reveals the ruse, only for neither Lisa nor Allison to win when Principal Skinner is impressed by Ralph's display of mint-condition Star Wars collectibles. In the B-plot, Homer finds an overturned truck of sugar and steals a load for himself. He tries and fails to sell it door to door before eventually the mound of sugar in the backyard melts during a rainstorm. Allison is a fundamental threat to who Lisa is as a person due to being a better version of herself. When you define yourself by a set of characteristics, seeing somebody else hitting all those same requirements can make you feel as though you're not good enough by your own standards. And these are really the only ones that matter. Emotionally healthy people don't try to gauge their success by metrics they don't care about. Lisa doesn't care about whether she's popular, but she does care about her intellect. But when somebody outperforms you in the areas where you put the most effort into, even a well-adjusted person can feel inadequate. But it isn't as though Lisa really has too much to worry about. While her visit to the Taylor family's house makes her even more concerned about the gaps between the two of them, it really should have had the opposite effect. Allison's father helps to support her intellectually, and has no doubt afforded his daughter plenty of opportunities to succeed that were never available to Lisa, whose father spent the entire episode trying to sell loose sugar with broken bits of glass inside. And so it would have suited her psyche better not to compare her current status to Allison, but her trajectory. After all, being at the top is less impressive if you were born there. Another Simpsons clip show. Marge fears that the romance has gone out of her love life and that this may spread to the children, who could grow up without an example of true romance. So she gathers the family around the kitchen table to relive the memories of past romances, with the Simpson family realizing just how much of their love seems to end in failure and heartbreak. But just when the story seemed to take a turn for the most depressing, Homer and Marge recall the one relationship they got right, their marriage. A second clip show, this one differentiating itself from the previous ones by focusing on a specific topic of the family's lives, their love. This reflects the general direction that Season 6 takes, focusing much more heavily on internal character struggles and having a few more love-themed episodes down the way. But as always, clip show episodes don't tell us much that you can't already glean by rewinding this video from the start. Itchy and Scratchy Land. Hearing about a discount on ticket prices, the Simpsons family goes to Itchy and Scratchy Land for their vacation. After a road trip, they arrive, and Marge is terrified by the violence there, wondering what kind of impact it might have on her kids when she just wanted them to have wholesome fun together. The group goes their separate ways, with Homer and Bart getting arrested, while Marge becomes embarrassed by association. But when the animatronics from the park begin to malfunction, the whole space is evacuated, save for the Simpson family. They're attacked when Homer realizes that flash photography shorts their circuits, allowing a means of fighting back. In the end, the family takes out the robot horde, and Marge is convinced that they really did get the togetherness that she had been seeking from the beginning. As much as The Simpsons is willing to take a closer look at the psyches this season, the tradition of set-piece episodes hasn't gone anywhere, as this one comes along with an extremely sparse plot, largely used for filler scenes and one-off gags about what if The Simpsons, but in an amusement park. And yet, this is the type of thing that made the show so great in the first place, as families can watch the show and point out exaggerations of their own antics as they appear on screen. And so for an episode like this to recapture that Season 1 sort of charm might be the real sign that The Simpsons is back on track, despite the overhaul of their team of writers. The animators working on this episode have mentioned that it was one of their favorites to produce, despite also being the hardest. The shots of violence were as enjoyable to create as they were for the audience to watch, and the physicality of it becomes a bit gratuitous at a certain point, something mirroring Marge's opinions on the park as a whole. Because for all the violence that you see in this show, it's only really reflecting the world surrounding it. If there wasn't such a demand, it wouldn't be there, and every Itchy and Scratchy cartoon reflects a very real demand for physical comedy, as existent in our world as it is in the world of The Simpsons. Sideshow Bob Roberts. After using a local right-wing talk show host to start a grassroots political campaign for his freedom, Sideshow Bob is able to leave Springfield prison and re-enter society, where he's then selected as the new mayoral candidate to run against Quimby. And despite the Simpson family helping Quimby's campaign, Bob is able to use his skills as an entertainer to win over the hearts of Springfield and the election. Once mayor, he enacts a plan to demolish the Simpson family's house using eminent domain, rendering them homeless as a means of getting back at Bart. But Lisa doubts the validity of the election results and begins to search for answers, only to meet with a disguised Smithers, who directs them to a name that can reveal the truth behind Bob's election win. This name turns out to be found in the cemetery, as the Springfield Republican Party was using the names of the dead to gather additional votes for themselves. So Bart and Lisa challenge the results directly, luring Bob into a trap, telling him that he's not smart enough to have pulled the gambit off on his own, which he responds to with an admission of his own guilt in masterminding the entire thing. Bob is re-arrested, and the Simpson family gets to keep their house. Every time Sideshow Bob returns, his plan to get back at Bart becomes slightly more elaborate and less stabby-stabby, and yet in doing so, his menace becomes even greater. While framing Krusty for a robbery by posing as the man was clever yet roundabout way of getting his own spotlight, something like committing massive election fraud in order to demolish the Simpson family's home, or tracking the family to another town to slay his nemesis with nobody around, is something with a bit less plain motivation and more of a lust for power. It comes across as being the type of thing that's no longer just about Bart, and his actions become grander in scale while still being very personal. Because most people who get to positions of power would have greater motivations for doing so than crushing a single enemy. It's so very cartoonish to make as elaborate a plan as this, solely for one boy. Some of the most overtly political writing the show has had so far comes from this episode, although it's not something altogether unexpected from The Simpsons. The show has never played close to its chest when it comes to revealing their political leanings, and you can only riff on modern culture for so long before it starts to become apparent what parts of modernity you have the most issues with. The awkward part comes from the fact that the showrunners are now promoting Quimby as the lesser of two evils when he serves as a stand-in for corrupt politickers for so many seasons. It's a somewhat depressing state of affairs when elections come down to selecting which self-interested maniac you want in charge, but also something that I doubt many Americans had an issue with seeing on television during such an apolitical era as the mid-90s. Treehouse of Horror V. The Shinning. Mr. Burns hires the Simpson family to look after his remote lodge over the winter, cutting the cable and confiscating all the beer to ensure honest work from the group. While there, it's learned by groundskeeper Willie that Bart has the Shinning, a royalty-free reference to The Shining, and can contact him telepathically. With no TV and no beer, Homer starts to something, and he's haunted by Moe, who convinces him to kill his family. Bart contacts Willie, but he's quickly incapacitated, so the Simpsons flee into the snow where they come across a portable television that he dropped, and the sight of TV's warm glow is enough to cool Homer's urge to kill. Time and Punishment. Homer breaks the toaster, and his attempts to fix it turn the device into a time machine. He's sent backwards to the age of dinosaurs, where he accidentally messes with the flow of time, and when he returns to the present, learns that the world is controlled by Ned Flanders. So Homer goes back and forth again, every trip revealing some new horrifying twist on what the present reality looks like. He ultimately ends up in a world just like the one he started in, but with his family having lizard tongues, which is close enough to normal for Homer to accept. Nightmare Cafeteria. Faced with an overcrowding issue in the school, as well as a lack of funding for cafeteria food, Principal Skinner comes up with a common-sense solution: eating students whenever they get sent to detention. The teachers become engorged with the new meals, and soon eat away most of the student body, ultimately winding down to just a handful of students. Bart, Lisa, and Milhouse try to make a break for it, but end up trapped atop a giant blender and fall inside. Only for Bart to wake up, as it was all a nightmare and the only thing to worry about is a fog that turns people inside out. Bart's girlfriend. Bart meets Jessica Lovejoy, the daughter of the minister back from boarding school. He quickly falls in love with her, but can't seem to get her attention no matter how well he behaves. But when Jessica catches him getting detention, she starts to notice him more, and Bart realizes that the two of them have the same bad personality. The two spend more and more time together, with Bart slowly realizing that Jessica's definition of misbehavior is too extreme for his tastes. But he stays with her due to infatuation, and soon winds up framed for stealing the collection money at church. His reputation ruined, Bart realizes he can't turn Jessica in, as she's the minister's daughter and has a positive reputation. But Lisa hears of Bart's situation and comes to his aid, revealing the crime to the whole church. As it turns out, the whole situation was a cry for attention from Jessica, although Lovejoy refuses to listen. In the end, Bart claims to have learned a lesson from the experience, though only in his words. Bart tries to reinvent himself twice during this episode. First, to become a better person outwardly, getting positive attention so he might impress Jessica. This ends up failing as he can't continue living while repressing a part of who he is. And later, he tries to become a visibly worse person, which likewise fails as he's still failing to stay true to himself. And yet Bart still makes this mistake despite himself failing to learn from his own experiences, believing that if he just stays dishonest for a while longer, he'll soon see Jessica mellow out, and the two can live together with a much less hectic experience. Bart believes he can change a person, despite having earlier in the episode suffered withdrawal for trying to change himself. But not as difficult as changing who a person is to change who a person is believed to be. Bart struggles with becoming a better person just as much as becoming a worse one, but the town of Springfield has no issue believing the latter change. People have a good view of Jessica and are willing to ignore her culpability in a crime, pinning it on Bart purely because it seems like something he would do. It's not surprising that Reverend Lovejoy would try to overlook the evidence against his daughter at the end of the episode, as while it's easy to find out that a person is wrong, it's much harder to admit that you yourself were the one wrong. Lisa on ice. Lisa learns that she's failing gym class and is offered the chance to get a passing grade as long as she takes up a Pee-wee sports team. She struggles to find a sport she's competent at, all the while noticing the extra attention that Bart is getting for his performance on a local hockey team. Then, during an argument with her brother, it's learned that she's a competent goalie and she's picked up for a team. Lisa's defensive skills help launch the team to victory, and the situation is reversed, with Bart ending up with less attention as Homer starts to give more and more attention to his daughter instead. The two teams eventually end up playing against one another, with the whole town of Springfield fired up to see the sibling rivalry play out on the ice. But when the game comes down to a final penalty shot, Bart and Lisa realize that they love each other too much to fight, and they call the game a draw, and they skate off together while the rest of the town riots. This episode shows the town of Springfield with an obsession with violence, regardless of where that violence is directed or why. And it's this desire to see bloodshed that drives the conflict between Bart and Lisa, rather than any sort of organically appearing issue between the two. While the two siblings were content with their different ways in life, it wasn't until outside forces pushed them against one another that they began to push back. But these external forces can only push so hard before Bart and Lisa both realize that there's no true bad blood between them. They don't hate each other, they were only told that they must in order to drive up interest in seeing them fight. And so it's this episode's ultimate lesson that's not so much one of rejecting violence as it is a lesson in knowing where that urge is coming from. Are you really the one at the center of your conflict, or is there another party pushing you towards hurting yourself and others for their benefit? The town of Springfield has no stake in the Simpsons' relationship, and therefore it doesn't care if it's damaged in their desire to see a fight. But Bart and Lisa know each other better than anyone, and are able to overcome the outside pressure by remembering that. Homer, bad man. Homer and Marge go to a candy convention, leaving the kids with a local grad student as babysitter. While there, Homer steals and then misplaces a gummy Venus de Milo, which winds up on the car seat as Homer is dropping off the sitter. It gets stuck to her ear, and Homer's attempts to remove it result in him being labeled as a sexual harasser. As more and more protesters surround his house, the media picks up on the story, and it spirals into a national incident, the Simpson family's attempts to clear their name not getting enough attention to make a difference. At least, not until groundskeeper Willie reveals that he had been secretly filming couples that night and caught Homer dropping the babysitter off. The footage clears his name, and Homer resolves never to fight against TV again. An episode that serves as a sort of spiritual follow-up to the previous one, where once again the mob refuses to take a person's feelings into consideration in order to be enraged and get a story from the experience. In this case, it's a media frenzy getting fired up more and more as people reject the truth in favor of what comes across as most interesting. Homer's pleas for common sense in defense of his innocence are ignored because the story of nothing happened doesn't sell ad space very well. The truth has no place on a for-profit medium when entertaining lies sell so much better, and so this is how fake news can spread and proliferate. People are willing to listen to lies as long as they're entertaining enough. But what this episode also calls back to is Season 1's Homer's Night Out, where a similar theme is shown off. Homer goes pre-internet viral after a photo of him dancing with the woman is spread around the city. In that episode, he gets a reputation as a ladies' man for his actions, yet here, he's given a much worse rep for similar actions. And while framing makes up a big deal, it's interesting to see how the public's perception of the perverted has changed in the 6 years that The Simpsons had aired up to this point. That it's reasonable for an angry mob to form, where once there was a mob of praise heaped instead. Grandpa versus sexual inadequacy. Homer and Marge are struggling to keep their love life active with the stresses of their children among other concerns. Their attempts to revitalize it fail until Grandpa Simpson hears of their struggle and comes up with the formula to re-energize Homer. This works, and Marge gives Homer the idea to bottle the formula and sell it. So Homer and Abe travel the countryside, selling Simpson & Sons Revitalizing Tonic. While on their road trip, they come across the house Homer was raised in as a child, and the two relive old memories, only for Homer to realize that Abe was never a very good father. They argue on the way home, which leads to Homer cutting Abe out of his life and resolving to spend more time with his kids, who at the moment are too busy trying to piece together where only adults have gone, unaware of the effects of the tonic. But Homer's attempts to fix his relationship with his kids are all too smothering, and he laments that he can't be a good father as he never had an example of one. But while having a revelation about how much his dad did for him, he accidentally burns down the old house. Around the same time, Abe also burns down the house, lamenting his own failures. The father-son duo rekindled their relationship in front of the kindling remains of the old house. Homer laments that his father's failure to raise him better wound up with him as a failure as well, something that ages a bit worse every year, but also something that explains a bit about his own mentality with his life. Because for all intents and purposes, Homer is a very successful individual. He has a 2-story house, a steady job, and a loving family. All of this despite growing up in the countryside with very little to his name. And while he still has the occasional trouble with family, these are things overcome by the end of a 22-minute stretch. Less so in the case of this episode, where his issues in bed were overcome because of Grandpa Simpson. So this episode comes down not just to Homer failing to realize the good thing he had in his relationship to his father, but by extension, the good things he had in his life in general. As he notices the various ways he has it well, he comes down to realizing just how and why things got that way, and Abe Simpson too realizes that perhaps Homer was right in his observations and that he could have done a better job, because like his son, he's also going to wish for more than what he's currently done. Fear of flying. Homer is banned from Moe's and tries to find a replacement bar to drink in, only to wind up at a bar specifically for pilots. When he imitates a pilot and winds up crashing a plane, the airline gives the family free tickets in exchange for keeping the story to themselves. They're excited to use them, only for Marge to reveal that she has a fear of flying and cannot go on planes. Homer tries to help her overcome this fear without therapy, as he fears that a therapist will drive her away from their marriage. But when Homer's attempts fail, he begrudgingly accepts paying for sessions. Marge tries to relive childhood moments, eventually coming back to her father, who she believed was a pilot growing up until one fateful day, where she boarded a plane and saw him working as a steward. But rather than making a big deal out of this, Marge's therapist instead remarks that the man was a trailblazer, tearing down gender norms and paving the way for equality. This change in perspective helps Marge to overcome her fear of flight, and the family is finally able to board a plane again. In keeping with the Season 6 pattern of new writers diving deeper into old characters, this episode serves as one of the first to really take a closer look at Marge's history, establishing more and more about her character in a way that was never really satisfied in the earlier seasons. And yet this new approach to character still manages to pay an homage to just enough of the old content that it makes a fitting addition to the Simpsons canon. Marge's life was never easy. Even as a child, finding encouragement for anything she did was hard, as her sisters and relatives were rarely kind to her. This has re-established itself in her mind as an aversion to praise, that all the things she does for other people shouldn't manifest any sort of acknowledgement, and that her role is to exist in the background, as any attention is negative attention. It's only by having a family that respects her that she was finally able to feel any recognition for her actions, but even this is too little too late. Marge refuses to accept any sort of therapy, less because she doesn't believe she needs it, and more because she doesn't want to create a hassle for anybody with her own needs, something that she begins to unlearn in this episode. Homer the Great. Homer is frustrated with his job, traffic, and life in general, made worse when he sees others close to him enjoying things that seem off limits to him. But when Lenny leaks that these things are the result of their participation in a secret society called the Stonecutters, he seeks a way to join, learning that Grandpa Simpson was a member and he's admitted by blood. Finally happy that he's found acceptance with the group, he turns his life around, only to accidentally destroy a sacred artifact of theirs, ending up stripped as a punishment. But when the Stonecutters see a unique birthmark, they realize that he's a chosen one in their order, propelling him to the top rank and making the whole organization under his control. He's even happier now, with everything he could possibly want being given to him. But this is a fleeting happiness as he no longer has a motivation to work towards anything. So at Lisa's advice, Homer begins to use his influence for good, making the Stonecutters become more active in the community as a force for positive change. But the old members view this as Homer going mad with power, and they all leave together, forming the Society of No Homers. In the end, Homer has lost everything, but takes some solace in the fact that he's still a Simpson. It's interesting to note that Homer is a misfit within the town of Springfield in spite of what he represents. Homer is meant to be the average American, and Springfield is meant to represent the average American town. The Simpsons was able to propel itself into cultural icon status through these two merits. And yet Homer doesn't belong to any sort of acceptable social circle. This then reflects the way that everybody else must feel, not belonging anywhere and constantly seeking out societal approval. And yet when Homer does achieve this approval, he still wants more, making it a self-fulfilling sort of mentality. Americans have a feeling of being lost due to the fact that even when we're found, we want more. Homer begins the episode as a Simpson and only learns to appreciate that fact once he's had more and then lost it, a reframing of what he's made through comparison. He wasn't happy as a stonecutter, so how could he be happy anywhere else? And the answer is not to seek happiness from others, but to achieve it internally. And Maggie makes 3. While looking through the family photo album, Bart and Lisa start to question why there aren't any pictures of Maggie compared to either of them. So Homer regales the tale of when Maggie was born. He had just paid off his debts working at the nuclear plant and was finally able to quit that soul-crushing job to follow his dream, working at the bowling alley. But when he and Marge are celebrating his new career move, the two wind up with an unwanted pregnancy. Marge is hesitant to tell Homer, as it would crush his dreams of financial freedom, but word gets out anyway, and Homer is soon forced to find some compromise to keep his dream job while also supporting his new family. But this compromise doesn't exist, and soon, Homer has to quit his bowling alley work to crawl back to the nuclear plant. Mr. Burns gives him a demotivating plaque saying, "Don't forget, you're here forever." And so Homer tells his children that all the photos of Maggie are in the place where he needs them the most, covering the plaque to remind him why he's really at the plant. The Simpson family has always somewhat represented a lost aspect of the American dream, that you can have everything you ever wanted out of life without being miserable for it. Because fundamentally, the purpose of work is to stop working. Everybody who's employed eventually dreams of the day they can retire. Few people ever really want to work for work's sake. It's just a means to an end. That end is achieving some amount of financial freedom so you can focus on doing what you really want to do, even if it doesn't pay well. But that's not a great way to plan your life. It's the same story we tell ourselves again and again. My life will start once I graduate high school. My life will start when I finish college. My life will start when I can get steadier work. My life will start when I retire. Eventually, you're bedbound and unable to do all the things you plan to do, realizing that the last several decades of living were the real thing. And so Homer has to accept that in this episode. Living your life doesn't begin at some arbitrary amount of wealth, but it began years and years ago, and waiting on things to change will only force you to waste what little time you have. So instead of living for himself by working at a bowling alley, Homer begins to do it for her. Bart's Comet. Bart pranks Principal Skinner's weather balloon, earning him the punishment of assisting with the man's amateur astrology. But while out there, Bart discovers a comet and reports it to Springfield's astronomers, getting it named after him. But when it's later discovered that the comet is on a direct collision course for the town of Springfield, they make an attempt to blast it out of the sky, which destroys the only bridge out. The townsfolk begin to panic, and the Simpson family makes their way to Flanders' fallout shelter. But they're not the only ones with this idea, and soon the rest of Springfield shows up at their door, asking for entry. Not one to turn people away, Ned accepts everybody, only to learn that the door can't shut as it's too crowded. So they come up with a system to decide who will be kicked out, agreeing that there won't be a need for left-handed stores in the new Springfield, and Ned is forced away. But the townsfolk remaining begin feeling more and more guilty that they've doomed him, and one by one, they leave to join him. In the end, the comet enters the atmosphere only to burn up from the town's layer of pollution and harmlessly collapse on the now empty shelter. This is about as optimistic an ending as The Simpsons can get, the whole town coming together to win a moral victory despite knowing it could mean their own deaths. And while it takes an apocalyptic event to make this come about, it's still a heartwarming story about the town meant to represent America. That no matter how messed up things get, and how much we're at each other's throats, we'll always do the right thing once we're pushed into a corner. But how far can those intentions really go when they're the result of such an extreme circumstance? It's nice to know that your neighbors might be on your side if push comes to shove, but for the rest of the time it's hardly balanced out, considering that people can be cruel enough to each other to make that worst-case scenario occur in the first place. Had Springfield been a bit more proactive in working together, then they wouldn't have been pushed into a situation with this level of guilt levied towards them in the first place. So while this episode has a happy ending, it's worthwhile to ask if the strife leading to that point was worth it. Homie the Clown. Krusty the Clown goes broke and has to open up a clown college to pay off some of his debts. When Homer is inspecting billboards on New Billboard Day, he sees the ad for this college and decides to enroll despite the confusion from his family. But after weeks of work, he graduates and begins the life of a professional clown. But this doesn't go especially well, as the new career path exhausts him, until he realizes that imitating Krusty gets him the celebrity treatment everywhere he goes. Homer exploits this newfound knowledge for a while until the real Krusty gets into trouble with the Mafia, who kidnap Homer, thinking he's the clown they're looking for. Homer is held at gunpoint and made to perform a trick for his life, which he fails at. But when the real Krusty shows up as well, both clowns have to perform it together. Krusty's clowning skills combined with Homer's end up impressing the Italian stereotype enough that they're set free, and the episode ends with Krusty paying off his debt. It's common trivia that in The Simpsons' early production, Homer was planned to be Krusty the Clown. This, alongside other oddities such as Marge's hair concealing bunny ears, were scrapped to make a more believable family dynamic than Homer moonlighting as a TV show host. But as The Simpsons developed over the years, that down-to-earth realism started to fade out. Soon it became a bit of an oddity that Homer couldn't be a clown for realism's sake, but he could easily travel to space without raising eyebrows. And so an episode like this comes in, bringing the dropped plot point to a full circle and showing off just how much has changed conceptually about the Simpson family since the initial pitch. Homer was meant to be Krusty the Clown as a sort of irony, that Bart would idolize the TV show host while disrespecting his father at home, a statement about the disparity between a person's public persona and their private life. We often adore those we see in the media, despite also knowing that these personalities are carefully curated. You don't like a celebrity, you like the character that their agents have crafted. And Bart only likes Homer when he's entertaining, a sort of dramatic irony to the audience who would be in the know. And yet this sort of family relationship is no longer needed. Bart may openly disrespect his father, but at the end of many episodes he's shown to go along with Homer's wants and wishes. Subconsciously, the family still loves each other in the same way that you would see on a TV dom-com. It's just that this love is earned through character strife instead of assumed. Bart vs. Australia. Curious to see if the Coriolis effect is true or not, Bart phones various locations in the southern hemisphere in order to ask which way their toilets turn. In the process, he winds up giving a $900 collect call to an Australian family, who take the matter up with their local government all the way to the Prime Minister. This turns into an international incident where Bart is forced to give an apology on Australian soil, something which the Simpson family views as an opportunity for a family vacation. While there, they take in a bit of the local culture before Bart is brought in front of the Prime Minister himself, only to learn that the US State Department sold him out and that he'll be booted as punishment. But Homer refuses to let his son, and by extension his country, be treated this way, and they flee back to the US Embassy. But once there, Bart decides that he needs to do the right thing and face his punishment, which is just a front to moon all of Australia before the family flees the country, leaving it to be destroyed by the invasive bullfrogs that Bart introduced. The Simpsons are a very well-traveled family, with the concept of a travelogue episode beginning to take footing around this time. Moving forwards, the Simpson family would be brought to some foreign location in order to make a couple jabs at the culture there about once per season. Famously, the writing staff never bothers to make the episodes at all accurate. This isn't to say that they don't research. These episodes often involve a large amount of study before they're written, with the research the writers do largely being thrown out in favor of including whatever's funniest for the script. And yet the travelogue episode is something that's managed to produce many of the most internationally remembered moments in show history. There was a real push at one time for Australia to rename their currency the Dollary-Doo in homage to this episode, among the other misnomered quotes from this episode supplanting the existing interpretation in pop culture. But this isn't purely due to the effect that The Simpsons has had on society. Australia itself has embraced their culture of shitposting and elevated it to an art form not unlike what this episode portrays it as. There's something to be said for a show that spends so much time making fun of America and being loved domestically for it to be able to share some of that ribbing with another country and to receive the same heroic treatment, with Bart vs. Australia becoming as much of an Australian cultural icon as The Boot. Homer vs. Patty and Selma. Homer loses a bunch of money investing in pumpkin futures and has to come up with a way to make it back. But he can't find anybody willing to give him a loan, and in desperation turns to Patty and Selma, who lend him the money for his next mortgage payment. But they use the knowledge of Homer's financial troubles as blackmail against him, demeaning him every chance they get until Marge eventually finds out. Homer tries to come up with a different way to pay them back and begins driving a limousine as a chauffeur, but he can't get his license without Patty and Selma's approval at the DMV, and they're eager to fail him on the driving test. But when the twins are caught smoking in a government building, Homer takes the fall for them, and with this kind act, Marge convinces them to call off the debt. In the B-plot, Bart takes ballet at school, as it was the only athletics class with availability. He hates the new art form at first, but once he finds that he's good at it, starts to embrace the dance in front of students at an assembly, albeit in a mask to hide his embarrassment about the subject. But despite being praised by the audience, once he unmasks himself, they still choose to beat him up. The animosity between Homer and the Bouvier twins is one of the more commonly explored dynamics in The Simpsons, up there with Homer versus Ned Flanders, Homer versus Mr. Burns, Homer versus Homer. It's a connecting thread of this episode's A-plot. Half the episode seems to want to tell a story of Homer being blackmailed, and the other half is about Homer driving chauffeur. But this whole thing is framed by his relationship to his sisters-in-law, and this is a relationship driven by a constant attack on Homer's insecurity. Patty and Selma fundamentally hate Homer because they believe that Marge could, and should, have done better than him, something that Homer also worries about on occasion. So when Patty or Selma denigrates Homer, they're also reinforcing a belief that he himself has been trying to dispel his whole marriage. The B-plot of this episode has Bart fear that he won't be accepted at school due to being in ballet, but upon realizing that, so long as he's good at it, he'll be adored, he starts to accept himself, but only because he thinks others will as well. This turns out not to be the case, as the acceptance of others can be fickle and even misleading, and so personal life satisfaction should not be derived from what others think of you. A Star is Burns. In order to reverse a belief that Springfield has no culture, the town decides to hold a film festival, organized by Marge Simpson. While looking for film critics to add to the panel of judges, she decides on a few local Springfieldianites, as well as Jay Sherman from The Critic. Jay stays with the Simpson family in the days leading up to the festival, but his wit and celebrity gives him preferential treatment from Marge and the Bouvier twins, causing Homer to have a fit that's remedied by Marge including him as a judge. The day of the film festival comes, and the town has all submitted their own videos to compete, including Mr. Burns, who has additionally bribed half the judges to give himself an edge over the competition. But Marge and Jay believe that Barney's movie is the best, leaving it at a deadlock to be broken up by Homer. After a bit of soul-searching, he decides to side with Marge and favor the more cultured movie. The Critic ran for 2 seasons, with the last few episodes of its second season being aired on the Fox network, this episode being the one to promote the move. Despite the slight uptick in ratings from The Simpsons' cross-promotion, the series was eventually taken off the air after only 2 months on the network, leaving this episode as one of the final vestiges of the show's cultural influence. The Critic was often viewed as a companion show to The Simpsons, with Al Jean and Mike Rice as showrunners, and some of the voice cast coming over as well. But despite these easy comparisons, there were some who didn't like the comparisons and liked the idea of a crossover promotion even less. Matt Groening wanted the shows to be as culturally far apart as possible, preferring that his creation have nothing to do with The Critic. He even went to the extreme of ensuring that his name would not be listed on the credits of this episode, the second such incident since Julie Kavner and Harry Shearer being left out if Krusty gets cancelled. And time has vindicated these beliefs. Not only did The Simpsons far outlast The Critic, but later complaints about The Simpsons cited celebrity obsession as a mark of its later downfall, and it's clear to see by now that this cameo problem is beginning to take on a less appealing form than before. Lisa's Wedding. While at a Renaissance fair, Lisa comes across a self-proclaimed psychic who offers to tell the story of Lisa's first love. It takes place in the far-off, distant year of 2010. Lisa is attending a high-end university when she grows annoyed with a man named Hugh Parkfield. But after spending some more time with him, the two learn how much they have in common and fall in love. Lisa visits Hugh's family in England, where she's impressed by their manners and politeness. But this only makes her more hesitant to introduce her new fiancé to her family, as she's rightfully afraid of the impression that they'll make. Hugh tries to grin and bear the Simpsons style, but on the day of the wedding, tells Lisa that he has no intention of ever seeing them again, insulting her hometown in the process. And so Lisa calls the wedding off, with Hugh returning home and the two never seeing each other again. Back in the present, Lisa reunites with Homer with a newfound appreciation for her family. Lisa has always had a complicated relationship with the rest of her family. At once, she both loves where she's from while hating that she's from there. Her family and hometown both represents a series of missed opportunities in her youth that held her back from a much higher potential as a human being. And yet it's this missed potential that's also responsible for her successes in life. Because it's one thing to be born into a wealthy family and to become refined like you. It's another to come from nothing and to become something. This flashback shows several characters' future jobs and lives, with nearly all of them having made some dramatic change, except for Homer and Marge. So for Lisa to not only have a much better life, but for that better life to be something expected, is a truer sign of her abilities than anything else. And these flash-forward episodes also show us just how many expected futures for America there are, just as much as they predict them for Springfield. Many of the more corrupt individuals have some sort of karmic future, and the honest types have been given promotions. It's not a surprise to see Bart at the controls of a wrecking ball, or for Patty and Selma to still be single. And while it's still a ways off that we'll begin to see some of the stranger aspects of the Simpsons' floating timeline, it's still a fascinating glimpse into what the past thought the present might look like. Dozen and One Greyhounds. Santa's little helper has far too much energy for the Simpson family to handle, so they try to find some way to tire him out, only for the dog to escape and run to the Greyhound track where the family originally found him. There he falls in love with another racer, She's the Fastest, who is sent home with the Simpson family as they lose their racing spirit once they're in love. The family takes care of the two dogs for a while, when one afternoon, She's the Fastest gives birth to a litter of 25 puppies. The family struggles to raise this many dogs, and eventually it's decided that they need to give them away. But the puppies don't like being separated, and so they need to find somebody who will adopt all 25, with only Mr. Burns volunteering. But Bart and Lisa are skeptical of his motives and sneak into his manor, where they learn of his plans to make a tuxedo out of the animals, all but one of them, as he enjoys when that dog stands on its hind legs. But before Mr. Burns can kill the dogs, Bart holds socks over the litter, causing them all to stand up, and for Mr. Burns to relent, vowing to never wear another animal who can perform a neat trick. As much as the Simpson family is a family, some of its members are more important than others in terms of the grand narrative, slightly underselling the narrative of their unity. Santa the Little Helper, Snowball 2, and to a lesser extent Maggie are the often forgotten about Simpsons. You can even tell that in some episodes, the writers forget that they're supposed to be there. But on the occasions that Santa's Little Helper is remembered, he's just as much of a Simpson as anyone else, his non-Euclidean geometry coming out on occasion, as well as ample ability to make pop culture references when needed. And of course, even if a dog can't talk, he can still facilitate commentary from other characters. Mr. Burns is shown as needlessly cruel in this episode. While he's always been a bad person, his scheming has never been something so overt. You got the impression in earlier seasons that Mr. Burns at least thought his actions were justified by some sort of social Darwinist pretense. But now he's just a bad guy for the sake of being a bad guy. And while this adds to The Simpsons' charm, it's still something that can damage the show's story moving forward if it's in too large of a dose. The PTA Disbands. With the equipment at Springfield Elementary falling apart, Miss Krabappel starts to grow furious with how cheap Skinner is when it comes to maintaining the bare minimum at the school. But he can't raise salaries or replace equipment with the budget constantly being slashed, leading to increasing conflict between the two. Realizing the potential for a teacher's strike, Bart eggs the two factions on until the teachers walk out. The PTA gets together to try to resolve this strike, but failing that, starts to bring in people from the neighborhood to teach in the meantime. This results in Lisa getting a subpar education, while Bart drives all the substitutes mad to the point of quitting. But the next substitute for his class turns out to be Marge, and unable to prank his own mother, he starts to get teased by the other students, to the point of finally wishing to resolve the strike. So Bart and Lisa lock Principal Skinner and Miss Krabappel in Skinner's office together, which gives the duo the idea to add more money to the budget by combining the school with the prison, ending the strike. A lot of what makes some of the early Simpsons jokes work so well is the subtle social commentary that's involved in the punchlines. Things like, they're trying to learn for free, work because of how commodified certain social services are, with people arguing vehemently against their funding while still hoping to reap the benefits of the system. The general state of Springfield is at once a comedic set piece while also being a representation of America without the social services needed to keep the country in order. In the end, the comparison between a for-profit prison system and a funding-less education system is drawn, with the implication of what these students' life's trajectory will be. And another thing that makes The Simpsons work is how the social commentary attaches itself to the characters. While Miss Krabappel might be a person in her own right, she also represents the pink-collar careers of America and how they're often overlooked by people who assume that they're meant for non-breadwinning domestic types. As well as Skinner, who is shown to be a person genuinely passionate about his role in the public school system, while also being the individual at the center of the budget pressure. This conflict is humanized in a way that makes it come across like nobody is in the wrong except the mob's refusal to compromise. Round Springfield. Bart eats a box of Krustios and consumes a jagged metal Krustio in the process. This causes his appendix to become inflamed, necessitating its removal. While the Simpson family is in the hospital for his surgery, Lisa comes across Bleeding Gums Murphy, and the two have a short reunion where he gives her his saxophone before a recital. That evening, Lisa plays in the recital and is able to perform well enough to steal the show, only to return to the jazz man and discover that he passed away during the performance. Distraught over his passing, Lisa decides to honor his memory by playing one of his albums on the radio. But the album in question is too pricey for her to afford it, until Bart gets his payment from a class action suit against Krusty the Clown regarding the contents of his cereal. Bart buys the album for his sister, as she was the only one to believe him when he said he was sick. Lisa brings it to a jazz station, and a freak lightning storm causes the record to be amplified across Springfield, letting the whole town enjoy his legacy one last time. Prior to the creation of this episode, the Simpsons writers planned to kill off a character to create something emotional, as there hadn't been any major character deaths prior to this point. One of the leading options was Marge's mother, but as her character is closely tied to a character with less development, they chose Bleeding Gums Murphy instead, which also gives a chance for Lisa to learn to emotionally cope with the loss of one of her idols. This loss is coped with through a final expression of his music, the idea that creators never truly die as long as their works still exist in the public consciousness. As long as Lisa continues to be inspired by his works, Bleeding Gums Murphy can never truly die. Fitting for this episode is when Bleeding Gums mentions that the life of a jazz man was a sad and lonely one until he met Lisa, as though his whole life led up to one good relationship. A few short years that make the whole life worth living. Lisa frets that she may not be able to give a proper send-off to the man until Bart gives her the means to do so, an extension of the bond the two musicians shared, now expressed through family. It isn't just music that Bleeding Gums Murphy will leave as his legacy, but a part of his soul will reside with Lisa's, surfacing every time she expresses herself. The Springfield Connection. After stopping a scammer downtown, Marge begins to seek more and more thrills from her boring daily life, so she enters the police station and asks for a job. After a bit of training, she's given the position and begins to enjoy her new career, although the amount of corruption gives her some hesitancy. Meanwhile, Homer is fearing that his position as the man of the house is being overtaken by his wife, and he refuses to take Marge's new role seriously. Made worse when Homer is arrested for harassing Marge while she's on duty. As time goes on, Marge begins to lament the way people are treating her, acting suspicious of her motives and cutting off contact. Eventually, on one of Homer's poker nights, Herman sneaks off to sell some counterfeit jeans, which Marge catches him doing, and after a chase, the counterfeiter is arrested. But the Springfield police take the jeans for themselves, leaving too little evidence behind to actually arrest the man, and he's set free, which is the last straw for Marge, and she leaves the police force. The Springfield police force is a common punchline in the town of Springfield, largely serving as an ineffective, if not downright malicious group that fails to prevent any of the higher-scale plots from occurring. It's not very interesting to watch a side character investigate a wrongdoing as much as it is to see Bart or Lisa foil the plans of Sideshow Bob, and so the police are often ignored when it comes to plots that involve any sort of legal stakes. It's the same reason Lionel Hutz is often chosen as the family's lawyer. If a competent lawyer could end the plot quickly, he'll be brought on board to ensure things stay interesting. But then this leads to a dynamic between the town of Springfield and their law enforcement. The people are suspicious of the police and hesitant to come to them for any assistance, as they know that Wiggum is unlikely to aid them. So why deal with the reduced amount of freedom around the police if there's no guarantee of safety? The tragedy of Springfield is not only its incompetent police force, but that one good cop can't undo the social damage caused by dozens of bad ones. Lemon of Troy. Marge lectures Bart about his lack of town pride, which causes him to rethink his relationship to Springfield and gain a new appreciation of its landscape. But a group from Shelbyville starts to agitate him, which escalates to the group stealing the lemon tree from the hill that divides the two cities. So Bart gathers a group of his friends to infiltrate Shelbyville and track it down, with the plan to steal it back. But when their parents learn that their son is missing, they gather the other parents of the missing children and follow them into Shelbyville to search for the lost kids. The two groups reconvene at the same time that they find the missing tree, trapped inside of a car impound lot. They use Flanders' RV to infiltrate the lot and steal the tree back, only narrowly escaping with the fruit. In the end, the kids celebrate the retrieval of their town's legacy, while the Shelbyvillians claim victory as well over the banishment of a haunted tree. Shelbyville is meant to represent the other town that practically everybody learns about growing up. The arbitrary rivalry that schools, university, and states always love playing up, mostly as a marketing campaign to sell tickets to sporting events. It's a sort of pseudo-nationalism, used to excite people over arbitrary borders that they wouldn't have cared about otherwise. And this episode plays a lot with the absurdity of that concept. Even the Shelbyvillians are designed to resemble specific Springfieldianites, further driving home that fact that they have much more in common than not. But the harshest arguments tend to come up between very similar locations and groups over increasingly trivial concerns. And this episode gets as much mileage as possible out of the absurdity of the whole conflict, from showing Lisa running across the dreaded Shelbyville border multiple times, to the initial disagreement that founded the Twin Cities in the first place. As much as Springfield represents America, Shelbyville represents America as well, and nobody hates America quite as much as Americans from a slightly different part of the country. Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. While burying the school hamster, groundskeeper Willie strikes oil beneath the school, and so Springfield Elementary becomes rich. They use this opportunity to begin buying the things they could never afford, expanding the music program, hiring new staff, and finally lifting the city's education system out of squalor. But Mr. Burns grows envious of the school's newfound fortune and slant drills the well before the elementary school gets the chance to, causing them to not only cut back their budget, but reduce staff further to pay for the construction of the well. But not wanting to stop there, he also declares his intentions of blocking out the sun over the town of Springfield, forcing them to consume more power from its energy monopoly. Smithers, disgusted by Burns' new low, announces his displeasure and gets fired for it. The well itself blasts into the Simpsons family's treehouse, wounding Santa's little helper. Moe's Tavern is flooded with toxic fumes, shutting it down and giving Barney no place to drink. The unregulated drilling creates a sinkhole beneath the retirement castle, destroying Abe Simpson's home. And Mr. Burns still can't remember Homer's name. With every single person in the town against him, a meeting is held where Burns taunts them one last time before activating his sunblock and wandering into the eternal darkness. But when he rounds a corner, he gets into a scuffle with an unseen assailant, and a gunshot rings out. Mr. Burns collapses on the sundial, and everybody wonders who shot Mr. Burns. For the Season 6 finale, the writing staff wanted to have a major event episode, something that would have higher stakes than usual and could potentially change the dynamic of the show moving forward. Sweepstakes and contests were held for fans to submit their guesses, and there's even a viral image of a sign in Vegas showing gambling odds for each member of the major cast, although this is likely a promotion more so than an actual table of odds, as gambling on the outcome of predetermined events was not legal there at the time. Famously, the writers wanted to ensure that the mystery was just that, a real mystery, and so special care was given to leave hints around the episode, necessitating the use of freeze-frame techniques to view them. These include things like nameplates for W. Seymour Skinner and Mo Sislak, driving the theory that Mr. Burns fell on the sundial in an intentional manner to point to who it was that shot him. A majority of this episode is dedicated to showing reasons why the citizens of Springfield would want Burns dead that expand beyond his typical villainy. Because if it's left to the more traditional devices, the question would be raised as to why nobody shot him before. What's especially interesting is the way that the town of Springfield would be driven to the mental state that they're prepared to kill, stroking guns in the town hall and lecturing on why he deserves to die. All of this without anybody acting out of character to facilitate this change. It makes sense that Bart loves his dog and would want to defend him. The two have been together since episode 1. It makes sense that Smithers would want to stop Burns, as he's always been the man's moral compass. And it makes sense that Homer would want him to remember his name, as Mr. Burns has always forgotten it. And America would have to wait another 4 months to learn who the culprit was, as will you as I work on the next part of this retrospective. Or, just Google it. Outro. The video's over now. You can stop watching if you don't care about me talking about semi-irrelevant stuff to The Simpsons. This is the second part to what will eventually be like a 10 or 11 part series, maybe less if I start covering more than 3 seasons per video, which I think will happen once the show starts to decline in popularity, but we'll see. I'm writing this thing by the seat of my pants with zero plans on the direction it will go in. I can't even decide on a consistent naming scheme for the titles. Anyway, I don't typically do the YouTuber outro thing, but in this case I'll make an exception, as this is part 2 of what I hope will be a multi-part series, so if you have an interest in watching me talk about seasons, 7 and on, go ahead and subscribe. I aim to upload on the 1st of every month, which is just longer than the YouTube algorithm's attention span, so even if you watch through all my content in a single sitting, you probably won't be recommended the next part unless you're subscribed. I may not have been totally comprehensive in this brief retrospective of the series, and if there's something glaring that I excluded that you think I should have mentioned, go ahead and comment such, although if it's especially bad, there's a good chance you've done so already. Don't worry, I do read every comment on my videos, even if I don't reply to all of them. This particular video is especially difficult to make considering that I spent about a week with a case of the shingles on my face. It swelled up so much I couldn't see out of my right eye, and had to write most of the script with an ice pack on my face, occasionally popping the blisters so my eyeball wouldn't be crushed by the pressure. I told you to maybe stop watching by this point, cause yeah, it just got gross. Graciously, this part will be cut out of the inevitable 34 season spanning full series, and this video is probably going to be unlisted too, but only in like 2 years. So I can say whatever I want to. Purple Monkey Dishwasher.